The call came in just after midnight, when the fog had already settled low and thick enough to dull the radio tower lights into pale, floating halos. I remember the sound before the words, the soft click of the handset lifting itself from sleep, the faint hiss beneath the ranger's voice, as if the line itself had been breathing long before I answered. Dispatch didn't sound alarmed. They rarely do. There was a report of a woman near Bump-Ass Hell, standing too close to the mud pots. White dress. No visible respirator, no flashlight, no vehicle logged at the trailhead. Just standing there, according to the hiker who called it in. Motionless at first, then moving. The word the hiker used was dancing, though even then, something in the pause before he said it made my fingers tighten around the receiver. I told dispatch I'd take it. I always do when Bump-Ass Hell is involved. The sulfur vents don't like crowds, and neither do I. By the time I parked the truck, the fog had thickened into something almost solid, clinging to the beams of my headlights like wet cotton. The smell hit me before I even opened the door, a sharp, metallic rot that crawled up the back of the throat and settled behind the eyes. Sulfur has a way of announcing itself, like a warning you can't ignore, no matter how long you've worked these trails. I pulled on my respirator, checked the seal by habit, and stepped out onto the boardwalk. Somewhere beyond the fog, the mud pots were awake. You could hear them long before you saw them. Wet, rhythmic blorps, like something large and patient turning over in its sleep. The boardwalk creaked under my boots as I moved deeper in. The fog swallowed everything beyond 10 feet, turning the familiar warning signs, stay on trail, thermal area danger, into ghostly silhouettes. My flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through the haze, catching flecks of moisture that glittered like ash. I told myself it was just another lost tourist, another person who underestimated how quickly these places can turn hostile. People see photos, daytime photos, and think the ground is solid, predictable. They don't realize the earth here is thin. Listening, waiting, I called out once, my voice sounding wrong inside the mask, too loud and yet somehow distant. "Park ranger, if you can hear me, stay where you are." The words vanished into the fog without an echo. The mud pots answered instead, their slow, obscene bubbling growing louder as I approached. Then I saw the white. It wasn't bright, not the way fabric should be under a flashlight. It was muted, dulled by the fog, as if the color itself had been leached of confidence. A dress. Yes. Long, trailing close to the ground. The hem hovered just above the mud, impossibly clean given where she was standing. She was positioned on a stretch of earth that should have collapsed under her weight, right between two active pots. Steam rose around her ankles in lazy spirals. She didn't react to the light. She didn't turn when I stepped closer. She just stood there, swaying, as though listening to music I couldn't hear. I stopped at the edge of the boardwalk. Every instinct I had told me not to step off. The ground there was a patchwork of crust and deception, solid one moment, boiling slurry the next. "Ma'am," I called again, softer this time, as if volume alone might break whatever spell held her in place. She moved then, not away from me, not toward me. She began to turn in place, slow at first, the fabric of her dress lagging a heartbeat behind her motion. Her arms lifted, elbows bending at angles that made my stomach tighten. Too sharp, too wrong, like joints forgetting their purpose. As she turned, my flashlight caught the ground behind her. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't leading toward the mud pots. They weren't scattered or panicked the way footprints usually are out here. They were neat, deliberate, and they were facing the wrong way. Each impression pointed away from the pots, as if she had climbed out of the earth instead of walking into it. The edges of the prints were already softening, the heat below beginning to reclaim them, but the direction was unmistakable. I felt a cold pressure settle between my shoulders, the kind that comes when your mind recognizes something before it understands it. She completed her turn then, and for a moment, the fog seemed to thin, just enough. Her face wasn't burned. It wasn't damaged in any way that made sense. There was no skin at all. Where her features should have been, there was a slow, molten surface glowing faintly from within, like lava beneath cooling stone. It shifted as she moved, thick and viscous, reshaping itself in subtle, terrible ways. And yet, there was a smile, not carved, not forced. A smile that existed because something beneath the surface understood the idea of it. The heat coming off her hit my mask, fogging the inside for half a second. And in that blur, she took a step, not toward the boardwalk, toward the nearest mud pot. The surface broke under her foot without resistance, swallowing her calf in a splash of boiling gray. She didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back, arms extended, and began to spin faster, her movements jerking and fluid all at once, like a puppet caught between strings and freedom. The bubbling grew louder, more agitated, as if responding to her presence. I realized then that the rhythm of her movement matched the sound, the spin, the pause, the wet churn of the earth. A dance, yes, but not for me. I took a step back. The boardwalk groaned in protest, loud enough to feel like a shout in the fog. Her head snapped toward me, that molten smile widening, the glow intensifying as if fed by attention alone. I felt a pull then, not physical. Something quieter, a suggestion, at the edge of thought, urging me to look longer, closer, to see. The fog thickened, curling inward, and for a moment I understood why people vanish out here without a trace. I broke eye contact and killed my flashlight. In the sudden dimness, with only the diffuse glow of the vents lighting the fog from below, I turned and walked away. Slowly, carefully, every step measured, every breath controlled. Behind me, the bubbling softened, returning to its patient rhythm. I didn't run. Running gives the ground permission to notice you. I reached the truck without looking back, my hand shaking just enough to fumble the keys. Later, when I filed the report, I wrote that the woman had retreated into the thermal area and could not be safely approached. I omitted the footprints. I omitted the smile. Some things don't belong in official records, but even now, when the fog rolls in thick and low, I remember the heat against my mask and the way the earth seemed to breathe in time with her movements. They warn visitors not to stare too long into the steam because of the gases. What they don't tell you is this: sometimes the smoke isn't rising from fire at all. Sometimes it's the exhale of something that noticed you standing there, watching, and wondered just briefly whether you might make a better partner for the dance. I didn't sleep after that night. I lay on the narrow cot at the station, respirator still on the table where I'd dropped it, listening to the building settle and cool. The walls clicked softly as the temperature fell, a sound I'd heard 100 times before, but now each tick felt like a countdown. When I closed my eyes, I saw the hem of that white dress hovering above the mud, untouched by filth, untouched by consequence. I told myself it was exhaustion, sulfur exposure, the mind filling in gaps with old stories and bad light. That's what we tell visitors when they swear they've seen figures in the steam. The brain hates uncertainty. It will invent certainty if it has to. By morning, the fog had lifted, revealing the usual postcard calm blue sky, distant ridgelines, the deceptive beauty that convinces people this place is tame. I drove back to Bump-Ass Hell with the survey crew under the pretense of checking the boardwalk. Officially, it was routine maintenance. Unofficially, I needed to see the ground in daylight. The mud pots were quieter than the night before, their surfaces cooling into cracked gray skins that shifted and split with slow impatience. Steam rose in thinner columns now, dissipating quickly in the sun. The spot where she'd stood looked no different from the rest. No scorched marks, no torn fabric, no sign that anything unusual had happened at all, except for the footprints. They were faint, already deforming under the heat, but still there if you knew how to look. The impressions were too deep for a person that light, the edges too clean. I crouched at the edge of the boardwalk and held my gloved hand near one of them. The heat was uneven, warmer at the heel than the toe, as if the foot had lingered there, pressing upward. I watched as the surface slowly softened, the print relaxing back into itself like a muscle unclenching. It took longer than it should have. Ground that hot doesn't remember shapes. It erases them. This was reluctant. I stood and scanned the area, suddenly aware of how exposed the boardwalk made me feel. The survey crew joked behind me, talking about launch plans and vacation days, their voices carrying too easily across the vents. I waved them back and told them to finish up ahead. When they were out of earshot, I did what I should have done the night before. I checked the old reports. The Lassen patrol keeps its archives in a room that smells of paper and dust. A low, constant hum from the dehumidifier filling the silence. I pulled maps, incident logs, anything that mentioned bum-pass hell after dark. There were the usual entries: lost hikers, minor burns, equipment failures. Then I found the red folders. Not marked as such, not officially. Just older reports with clipped corners and a different weight to them, filed out of sequence as if someone hoped they'd be overlooked. I sat on the floor and read. The first mention was from 1932. A ranger named Calder wrote about a figure in white seen during a nighttime patrol, moving with an unnatural grace near the vents. He noted footprints, contrary to expectation, then crossed the line out, hard enough to tear the paper. The report ended abruptly, reassigned to wildlife activity. The next was from the 1950 seconds. A maintenance worker claimed he heard music no source identified, followed by laughter like steam escaping a valve. His supervisor added a note about stress leave. Then there were the gaps. Years where nothing was recorded at all. Silence, thick and deliberate. I closed the folder and leaned back against the shelf, the metal cool through my shirt. Patterns are dangerous things. You can find them anywhere if you look long enough. Still, the timing gnawed at me. Sightings clustered around certain years, certain months, always after prolonged seismic quiet, as if something below noticed the stillness and used it as an invitation. That afternoon, I returned alone. No crew, no radio chatter. I stayed on the boardwalk, eyes forward, refusing to scan the steam too closely. The smell was lighter now, but it lingered in the back of the throat, a reminder you couldn't swallow away. I walked the length of the path slowly, counting steps, grounding myself in routine. Halfway through, the air shifted. Not the wind, something subtler, a change in pressure that made my ears pop and my skin prickle. The bubbling behind me fell out of sync, stuttering like a skipped heartbeat. I stopped. The sound resumed, but different now. Softer. Almost cautious. I felt the urge to turn, to check, to confirm that I was alone. That urge wasn't fear. It was curiosity, sharpened to a fine point. I imagined what I might see if I looked steam parting just enough. White fabric emerging, clean and whole. A face restored, almost human. The thought carried a strange comfort with it. The promise of answers. I gripped the railing until the wood bit into my palms through the gloves. No, I said aloud, the word swallowed by the vents. Saying it helped. It always does. When I finally did turn, there was nothing there but steam and sunlit haze. The mud pots simmered, indifferent. That night, the dream started. I stood on the edge of the boardwalk, watching footprints form one by one, rising from the earth as if pressed from below by invisible feet. They moved closer with each breath I took, matching my rhythm, waiting for me to look down. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat, and the smell of sulfur clung to my hair as if I'd been standing in the vents for hours. I tried to ground myself in facts. Sulfur exposure can cause hallucinations. Sleep deprivation does the rest. I filed a request for a temporary reassignment. It came back. Denied. Unsigned. The next evening, a call came in another sighting. Same area. Same description. This time, 2 hikers. This time, they mentioned the smile. I didn't tell dispatch what I'd found in the archives. I didn't mention Calder or the maintenance worker or the years of silence. I just said I'd handle it. As I drove back toward Bum-Pass Hell, the sky darkened faster than it should have. Clouds rolling in low and heavy, pressing the light flat. The fog followed, eager and thick, swallowing the road until the world narrowed to the reach of my headlights. When I stepped onto the boardwalk, the air felt warmer than the night before, humid in a way that clung to the skin. The bubbling was louder, more coordinated, as if several pots had agreed on a shared tempo. I moved slowly, scanning the ground ahead of me, careful not to let my gaze linger on the steam. That's when I noticed the footprints again. They were fresh, deeper, and they were cooling. I knelt at the edge, ignoring the warning bells ringing in my head, and hovered my hand above the nearest print. The heat rose in waves, but beneath it was something else, a steady warmth that felt alive. The surface shifted slightly, responding to my presence. I pulled my hand back too late. A sudden pulse of heat licked my glove. Not burning, not quite touching, but close enough to leave a tingling ache in my fingers. The bubbling surged in response. Behind me, something moved in the fog. I didn't turn right away. I listened. There was the faint whisper of fabric, the soft drag of a hem against damp wood. The sound circled, unhurried. When I finally faced it, she was closer than before, standing just off the boardwalk, steam curling around her ankles like affectionate hands. The dress was still white, but now it glistened, damp with condensation. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if she were learning restraint. She tilted her head, the molten surface of her face dimmer now, cooling, hardening into something almost solid. The smile remained, thinner, more knowing. I felt that pull again, stronger this time, urging me to step down, to feel the ground for myself, to understand. The fog thickened, closing in, and for a moment, I thought I heard music beneath the bubbling, a low, rhythmic hum that matched my heartbeat exactly. I stepped back instead. The boardwalk creaked. The sound broke whatever spell had been tightening around my thoughts. Her head snapped up, the glow beneath her surface flaring briefly, and the ground beneath her feet churned in agitation. I didn't wait. I retreated, slow and steady, refusing to look back until the truck was in sight. Later, alone in the station, I added a note to the red folder. Not an official report, just a warning, written in the margins where someone else might see it if they knew where to look. Do not approach after dusk. Do not look into the steam. The footprint's cool because something beneath is learning how to surface. I don't know if that'll be enough. The ground here remembers things it shouldn't. And sometimes, when the fog is thick and the vents fall into that patient rhythm, I swear I can hear the soft scuff of feet climbing upward, testing the air, waiting for someone to watch long enough to be invited down. By the third night, I stopped pretending this was an isolated incident. The park has a way of training you to respect patterns, animal trails, weather shifts, thermal cycles, but this was a pattern that refused to sit still. It moved when watched, adapted when challenged. I could feel it now in the way the station itself seemed uneasy, as if the walls were listening for footsteps that never came down the hall. I poured stale coffee and let it go cold in my hands, staring at the red folder spread across the desk. The notes I'd added felt insufficient, like chalk marks on a rising tide. Whatever was happening at Bump-Ass Hell wasn't repeating. It was progressing. I drove out before dusk, earlier than usual, hoping daylight would blunt whatever edge the place had found. The sky was a washed-out gray, the sun a pale disk struggling through thin cloud. Even from the parking area, I could hear the vents more active than they'd been in weeks, the mud pots popping in quick, impatient bursts. The smell was heavier too, sulfur thick enough to coat the tongue. I pulled on my respirator and stepped onto the boardwalk, the wood already warm beneath my boots. She wasn't there at first. The vents simmered, steam rising in lazy plumes that broke apart in the breeze. I walked the length of the trail slowly, scanning the ground, forcing myself not to linger on the steam's shifting shapes. Halfway through, I noticed the rhythm again. Not random, not chaotic. The bubbling was settling into a cadence, a repeating sequence that felt deliberate the longer I listened. I stopped and closed my eyes, counting the beats under my breath. The pattern held. 3 quick pulses, a pause, one long surge, over and over. When I opened my eyes, the fog had begun to creep back in, thin at first, threading itself between the vents like cautious fingers. That was when I saw the movement not in front of me, but reflected faintly in the sheen of moisture on the boardwalk, a pale shape circling just beyond my peripheral vision. I didn't turn. I followed the reflection instead, tracking the slow arc of white as it moved in time with the sound. She emerged from the steam a few yards ahead, already in motion. The dress clung to her now, damp and heavy, the fabric tracing the wrong angles of her body as she twisted and bent. Her movements were smoother than before, less jerking, as if practice had softened the edges. The ground beneath her feet responded, bubbling in sync, each step drawing a low, eager churn from the mud. I realized with a jolt that the vents weren't reacting to her. They were accompanying her. I stayed on the boardwalk, hands tight on the railing, and watched. The heat radiating from her was stronger now, fogging the edges of my visor. The molten surface of her face had cooled further, darkening into something closer to stone, fissures glowing faintly beneath like embers under ash. The smile remained, but it was smaller, more contained, focused. She wasn't performing for me. She was rehearsing. The ground shifted under her weight, not collapsing, but yielding just enough to allow her steps. Each footprint lingered longer than the last, the edges firming instead of softening. I felt a creeping dread as I understood what that meant. The earth was learning how to hold her, and in doing so, it was changing. I keyed my radio, the familiar click grounding me for half a second. "Dispatch," I said, keeping my voice steady, thermal activity increasing at bump pass hell. "I'm observing unusual ground stabilization." The words sounded ridiculous even as I spoke them, stripped of context and truth. The reply came back distorted, the signal warbling under a layer of static. I caught fragments. "Copy. Say again. Signal interference." Then the line went dead. The music started then. Not loud, not clear. A low, humming tone that vibrated more than it sounded, resonating through the boardwalk and up into my bones. It matched the bubbling perfectly, weaving itself into the rhythm until the two were inseparable. I felt my heartbeat adjust without my permission, sinking to the pattern. 3 quick pulses, a pause, 1 long surge. My breath followed, shallow and quick, and slow and deep, as if something else were setting the pace. She turned toward me mid-step, her movements never breaking stride. For the first time, she raised her head fully, the glowing fissures of her face brightening as they met my gaze. The pull intensified, no longer a suggestion but a firm, insistent pressure, urging me to step down, to join the rhythm, to complete whatever shape the dance was carving into the ground. Images flickered at the edge of my thoughts, stone arches forming beneath the surface, hollow chambers warming and widening, waiting. I shook my head hard enough to rattle my teeth, breaking eye contact. The music faltered, just for a moment, and the bubbling stuttered in response. She reacted instantly. The smile vanished, replaced by something sharper, more intent. Her movements grew faster, more forceful, heels striking the ground with a wet, resonant thud that sent ripples through the mud. The vents surged, steam blasting upward in thick columns that closed around her like curtains. I backed away, every step deliberate, fighting the urge to run. The boardwalk groaned under the strain, the wood vibrating with the rhythm beneath it. I reached the end and turned, forcing myself not to look back until the vents were a distant hiss behind me. The music faded as I put distance between us, my heartbeat slowly returning to its own erratic pace. That night, I didn't bother with the cut. I sat at the desk, maps spread out, marking the vents that had grown more active over the past week. A shape emerged as I connected the points, a rough circle centered on the spot where she danced. A ring, a boundary, or maybe a foundation. The red folder lay open beside me, its earlier report suddenly reading like the first lines of a long, unfinished warning. Calder's crossed-out note about footprints, the maintenance workers' laughter in the steam. All of it felt less like coincidence and more like groundwork laid over decades. Near dawn, I added another note to the margins, my handwriting cramped and hurried. She is not wandering. She is preparing the ground. The dance is not for us, it is for what waits below. I paused, then added one more line, smaller, almost an afterthought. If the rhythm completes, the surface may no longer hold. When I finally stepped outside, the air was cold and clear, the vents quiet in the early light. For a moment, I let myself believe the worst of it retreated with the night. Then I noticed the warmth under my boots, spreading outward from the direction of bump pass hell. Steady and patient, like a held breath waiting for the next cue. By the time I understood what the ring meant, It was already too late to pretend it was only theory. The ground around Bumpass Hell had changed its behavior in ways that didn't show up on any instrument we trusted. Surface temperatures fluctuated without warning. Pressure vents opened and sealed themselves again within minutes, and the familiar, chaotic bubbling had settled into something disturbingly orderly. I walked the perimeter at dawn, boots sinking slightly into earth that should have been firm, and felt warmth radiating outward in a near-perfect circle. Not spreading, maintaining, like a boundary that knew where it was supposed to end. I started sleeping in short shifts, an hour at most, waking each time to the same dream. Standing at the center of the ring, the boardwalk gone, the ground beneath me firm and welcoming. In the dream, the smell of sulfur wasn't sharp or choking. It was sweet, almost floral, and the heat felt like a hand pressed flat against my back, guiding me forward. I'd wake with that pressure still lingering, my shirt damp, my pulse racing in time with a rhythm I couldn't hear anymore but somehow remembered. I took the maps down to the archives again, spreading them across the long table beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. Older geological surveys, hand-drawn trail plans, seismic readings going back decades. When I layered them, tracing the vents that flared and died over the years, the pattern emerged with uncomfortable clarity. The ring wasn't new. It had been forming for a long time, shifting slightly with each cycle, correcting itself when the earth moved. The dance wasn't creating it from nothing. It was finishing it. At the center of the ring, marked faintly on an old, nearly forgotten map, was a notation in pencil. No official label, just a ranger's shorthand from the early days of the park. Unstable ground, do not linger. I recognized the handwriting from Calder's report. My throat tightened. He hadn't been describing a hazard. He'd been warning whoever came after him to keep moving, to not stay long enough to be counted. That evening, the sky darkened early, clouds pressing low over the ridgeline. The air felt heavy, charged, every sound carrying too far and then cutting off abruptly. I drove out without calling it in. Some part of me knew that bringing others would only add to whatever was building there. Witnesses matter. I parked farther back than usual and walked the rest of the way, the boardwalk creaking softly as I stepped onto it. The vents were active but subdued, as if waiting for a signal. She was already there, not dancing, standing still at the center of the ring, feet planted firmly on ground that should have swallowed her whole. The fog parted around her in a wide berth, leaving a clear space that felt deliberately maintained. The dress was no longer white. It had taken on the dull gray of cooled ash, streaked with darker stains where steam had condensed and dried. Her face had hardened further, the molten glow now confined to thin lines tracing the suggestion of features beneath. A face learning how to be worn. I stayed at the edge, heart pounding, the pull stronger than ever. The rhythm was there too, faint but insistent, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. 3 quick pulses, a pause, one long surge. I realized with a sinking clarity that it matched the seismic readings from the past week. The ground itself was moving to the same beat. She lifted one arm and pointed not at me, but at the ground between us. The surface there shimmered, heat rippling the air. Then it sank, slowly, deliberately, forming a shallow depression that deepened by the second. I watched as the crust pulled back like a curtain, revealing darker earth beneath, glowing faintly from within. The smell intensified, sulfur thick enough to make my eyes water even through the mask. I took a step back. The boardwalk groaned in protest, and the sound echoed strangely, distorted as it crossed the ring. She tilted her head, studying me, and for the first time I felt something like impatience radiating from her. This wasn't about seduction anymore. It was about completion. The ring needed a final measure, a closing note to lock it into place. The realization hit me hard enough to steal my breath. The ring wasn't just a structure. It was a boundary between states, a seal meant to be closed from above. The dance warmed the ground, taught it to hold shape, but it couldn't finish itself. It needed a living anchor, someone to stand at the center long enough for the earth to recognize them as part of the pattern. Calder's crossed-out note made sense now. The maintenance workers' laughter. They hadn't been victims. They'd been almost volunteers. The ground pulsed, the depression widening, and the rhythm grew louder, audible now, as a low, resonant hum that filled the fog. I felt my feet itch to move, muscles tensing as if preparing to step down off the boardwalk. My mind raced, searching for a way out that didn't involve turning my back or looking too long into the steam. Warnings surfaced unbidden. Fragments of old training manuals and half-forgotten ranger lore. Do not linger. Keep moving. Do not let the ground learn your name. I forced myself to speak, the sound of my own voice anchoring me just enough. You don't need me, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. The woman, the ground, or whatever waited below. This place is held without me. She moved then, stepping closer to the boardwalk, her footfalls heavy and deliberate. Each step sent a surge through the ring, the depression deepening in response. The smile returned, thin and patient, and I understood with a sick certainty that she had learned restraint only to apply it better now. The fog thickened behind her, closing off the path I'd come from, the world narrowing to the space between us. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded map, the one with Calder's pencil mark. I held it up, the paper trembling in my grip. He knew, I said. You didn't get him. The words felt important, though I didn't know why. For a moment, the rhythm faltered. The hum dipped, the vents stuttering like a skipped breath. Her smile wavered. It was enough. I stepped sideways instead of back, keeping my eyes on the edge of the ring, refusing to face the center directly. The boardwalk creaked, but the sound didn't echo this time. The fog resisted, clinging to me, but I pushed through, every step a small act of defiance. Behind me, the rhythm surged again, louder, angrier, but it didn't follow. The depression in the ground shuddered, and slowly began to fill, the crust drawing itself back into place with visible reluctance. I didn't stop until the vents were a distant hiss, and the smell of sulfur had thinned to a faint, bitter memory. Back at the station, I added the final note to the red folder, my hand shaking despite myself. The ring is a seal. It requires a witness willing to remain. Avoid the center at all costs. Movement disrupts the pattern. I closed the folder and locked it away, though I knew locks were symbolic at best. That night, as I lay on the cot, the rhythm returned, softer now, tapping at the edges of sleep. Somewhere beneath the park, something shifted, adjusting its expectations. The ring hadn't closed. It had only learned what to wait for. I told myself I had done enough, that the folder was locked, the warnings written, the pattern understood well enough to be avoided. Rangers survive by learning when to step back, when to leave a place to its own cycles. Lassen had always rewarded that kind of respect, but respect is different from attention, and attention once given is hard to take back. The nights after I sealed the folder were quieter on the surface, fewer calls. No new sightings logged. The vents returned to their familiar, unruly bubbling, the kind that reassures you nothing intelligent is coordinating it. Visitors came and went, took their photographs, laughed at the smell, moved on. The park wore its harmless face again. I almost believed it. Almost. The rhythm didn't stop. It softened, yes, retreating to a place just below conscious hearing, but it was still there. I felt it most clearly in the early hours, when the station was dark and the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing. 3 quick pulses, a pause, one long surge. It followed me into sleep and waited there, patient, tapping gently at the edge of dreams. On the 4th night, the radio crackled on its own. No call sign, no preamble, just a brief wash of static that resolved into a sound I recognized too well. The low, resonant hum of the vents carried over a frequency that shouldn't have reached this far. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. Beneath the hum was something else now. Footsteps, slow, measured, the soft drag of fabric over wood. I shut the radio off. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. For a long moment, I sat there, waiting for the hum to bleed through the quiet anyway. It didn't. Instead, the smell of sulfur crept into the room, faint but unmistakable, curling through the stale air like a reminder. I didn't go back to Bum Pass Hell that night, or the next. I avoided the place entirely, rerouted patrols, cited maintenance issues when asked. Distance, I told myself. was the only way to break whatever fragile connection had formed. The park has many ways to punish arrogance, and I'd seen enough to know when I was outmatched. Then, the dreams changed. I was no longer standing at the edge of the ring. I was walking the boardwalk alone, the fog parting politely as I passed. The ground beneath my feet felt solid, welcoming, warm, but not dangerous. In the center, she waited, not dancing, not beckoning, just standing there, hands folded, head inclined as if listening to a vow only she could hear. When I tried to stop, my feet kept moving, carrying me forward in time with the rhythm that now felt like my own heartbeat. I woke each time just before stepping off, lungs burning, sheets twisted tight around my legs. And always, in the moment before consciousness returned fully, I felt it, the sense of being observed, not with hunger or malice, but with patient certainty, as if something had already accounted for me, measured my steps, and found them acceptable. The final call came a week later, just before dawn. A lone hiker, voice shaking, reporting a figure in gray standing near the vents. He mentioned footprints that didn't make sense. He mentioned music. I closed my eyes and listened, not to the details, but to the spaces between his words, the hesitation, the awe creeping in despite his fear. I told him to leave the area immediately, to keep moving and not look back. He agreed too quickly. The line went dead before I could say anything else. I drove out anyway, not because it was my duty, because some part of me understood that avoidance had only delayed what was always meant to conclude. The sky was lightening as I arrived, the fog thinning into pale ribbons that clung low to the ground. The boardwalk was empty. The vents were quiet. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it all, if exhaustion and isolation had finally gotten the better of me. Then I saw the footprints. They crossed the boardwalk this time. Neat, deliberate, cooling far too slowly for the temperature of the air. They led to the center of the ring, which was faintly visible now even in daylight. A subtle difference in the way the ground held heat. At the center stood the depression I'd seen before, shallow but unmistakable. Waiting. She wasn't there. The absence hit harder than her presence ever had. The air felt wrong without her, the rhythm unmoored, searching. I stood at the edge, heart pounding, and felt the pull intensify, desperate now, as if something below feared being abandoned mid-ritual. The ground pulsed once, twice. The third pulse lingered, stretching the moment thin. I took a step back. The rhythm faltered. The pulse weakened, the warmth receding slightly. Relief washed through me, sharp and disorienting. Maybe this was it. Maybe the absence of a willing witness was enough to collapse the pattern entirely. I turned away, ready to leave, when the radio on my belt crackled to life. "Elias," my own voice said, calm and steady. "You're early." I froze. The fog thickened around me, the world narrowing to the sound of that familiar cadence. "It doesn't work if you rush it," the voice continued. "You have to stay. You have to let the ground finish learning you." I didn't answer. I didn't look back. I walked. Each step felt like wading against a current, the pull fighting me harder with every inch of distance. Behind me, the rhythm surged, angry and uneven now, the vents erupting in sharp, chaotic bursts. I reached the truck, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting the door open. As I drove away, the smell of sulfur clung stubbornly to the cab, refusing to be aired out. In the rearview mirror, the fog closed in behind me, erasing the trail, the boardwalk, the ring. It looked, for a moment, like a veil being drawn. I filed the last report that afternoon. Not in the system, not in the red folder. I wrote it on a single sheet of paper and burned it in the station sink, watching the words curl and vanish. Some warnings don't survive being written down. They pass, instead, from voice to voice, from one sleepless listener to the next. I transferred out of Lassen a month later. Different park, different ground. The dreams followed for a while, then faded, leaving behind only the faintest echo of that rhythm, easy to ignore if you don't listen too closely. Sometimes, though usually just before dawn, I wake with the certainty that something has shifted back there, that the ring has warmed again, that the bride, patient as stone and steam, has found another set of footsteps willing to linger, So if you ever find yourself standing on a boardwalk above ground that breathes, watching the fog curl and part as if expecting you, remember this. Don't stop. Don't listen for the music. And whatever you do, don't let the earth learn your name, because it only needs one witness to finish the dance. Story 2. The first thing you notice at the Lassen relay station isn't the height, or the cold, or even the way the wind seems to arrive a few seconds before you hear it. It's the silence between signals, a hollow pause that feels measured, deliberate, as if the mountain itself is waiting for something to answer back. I realized that the night I drove up the service road with the engine off, coasting the last stretch to save fuel, and found that the radio was still humming softly even though I'd turned it down to 0. The station sits above the tree line inside Lassen Volcanic National Park, a low concrete structure bolted into blackened rock like an afterthought. It was built in an era when redundancy meant survival backup generators, backup transmitters, backup of the backup. By the time I was sent there, most of that equipment was obsolete, left in place only because removing it cost more than forgetting it. Officially, my job was simple. Diagnose intermittent interference reported across several ranger channels, static bursts, signal bleed, echoes where there shouldn't be any. I arrived just before dusk, the sky already bruised purple and gray, clouds dragging low enough to scrape the towers. Inside, the station smelled of dust, old insulation, and something faintly metallic ozone, maybe, or the ghost of too many overheated circuits. I flipped on the lights and listened as the room came alive. The soft whir of cooling fans, the distant clatter of wind against the antenna mast, and beneath it all, a barely perceptible thump. Slow, steady, too regular to be coincidence. I checked the boards first. Levels were nominal. No surges, no obvious feedback loops. The thump persisted, vibrating faintly through the metal rack, more felt than heard. I put on the monitoring headphones and swept through the frequencies, expecting to catch the interference in the act. What I found instead was silence so clean it felt artificial. No hiss, no background noise. Just an empty channel that made my ears ring as my brain tried to fill the void. Then the thump came through the headphones. Not a sound effect. Not a recording artifact. A low, wet percussion, like a hand pressed rhythmically against a membrane. I froze, breath held, and waited. The sound repeated. Once, twice, 3 quick pulses, a pause, one longer, heavier beat. The pattern sent a chill through me, not because it was loud, but because it felt familiar, like a rhythm I'd known without realizing it. I pulled the headphones off and listened with my bare ears. The room was quiet. No thump. No vibration. I put them back on. There it was again, clearer now, echoing faintly as if bouncing off unseen walls. I glanced at the waveform monitor. The spikes were there, crisp and clean, registering as a live input, but there was no source, no mic open, no external feed routed in. I told myself it was a grounding issue. Old buildings develop quirks. Mountains are full of electromagnetic nonsense. I adjusted filters, narrowed the band, isolated the channel. The thump followed every adjustment, matching me step for step, as if it were listening. That was the first unsettling thought. This isn't broadcast noise. Noise doesn't adapt. I leaned closer to the console, the glow of the displays painting the room in pale green light, and slowed my breathing without really thinking about it. The thump slowed too. The longer beats stretched, dragging, then shortened again as my pulse picked up. I swallowed hard, heart racing now, and the rhythm responded instantly, accelerating to match. I ripped the headphones off again, chest tight, and paced the small room. The thump vanished the moment the connection broke. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and uneven. I laughed once, sharp and humorless, and told the empty room that I needed sleep. I didn't leave. Something about the station held me there, an unspoken insistence that this problem wouldn't solve itself without an audience. I sat back down and pulled the headphones on again, this time deliberately slowing my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale. The thump followed, obedient and exact. When I held my breath, the sound paused completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It felt expectant, stretched thin, as if the frequency itself were waiting for permission to continue. When I finally inhaled, the thump returned with a force that made me flinch. Louder now, closer, reverberating through the headphones as if whatever produced it had leaned in. I reached for the logbook, hands unsteady, and began to write. Unidentified rhythmic signal detected, responsive to operator's respiration and heart rate. The words looked ridiculous on the page, stripped of the unease that crawled up my spine. I paused, pen hovering, and added a note in the margin. Feels like the station is listening back. The wind picked up outside, rattling the tower hard enough to make the lights flicker. For a moment, the thump faltered, breaking its pattern. I exhaled in relief and froze as the sound resumed, correcting itself, settling back into perfect sync with my pulse. Then a second rhythm joined it, fainter, slightly delayed, an echo that didn't belong to me. I held perfectly still, afraid to breathe, afraid to confirm what my instincts were already screaming. The two rhythms drifted closer together, aligning, overlapping, until they were nearly indistinguishable. I realized with a sick lurch that the second beat wasn't random. It was adjusting, learning my timing, finding the spaces between my breaths. The radio crackled softly, and a voice slipped through the static, too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably human in its cadence. It rose and fell with a dual rhythm, shaping itself around the sound like a throat remembering how to speak. I felt a cold pressure bloom at the base of my skull, the same sensation you get when someone stands too close behind you. I did the only thing I could think of. I spoke. "Who's there?" My voice sounded wrong in the small room flattened by fear. The thump didn't stop. The second rhythm drew closer still, merging until there was only one, steady and strong. Then the voice came through clearly, without distortion, without static. It was my voice. "Don't turn around," it said calmly, as if offering advice long overdue. "The station can hear you better when you're facing the window." Behind me, the glass rattled as the wind surged again, and for the first time since arriving, I felt absolutely certain that I was not alone in that room, or on that frequency. I didn't turn around, not because I was brave, or disciplined, or following some half-remembered protocol, but because the certainty that flooded me in that moment was absolute and paralyzing. If I looked away from the console, whatever was matching my heartbeat would gain something it didn't yet possess. Orientation, confirmation. The window behind me rattled again, harder this time, and the glass gave off a thin, high whine as pressure built against it. I focused instead on the waveform display, on the way the spikes rose and fell in perfect symmetry, no longer reacting to my pulse but anticipating it, cresting a fraction of a second before my heart followed. I reached out and cut the channel. The headphones went dead, plunging my ears into a soft, cottony silence. The sudden absence of sound was disorienting, like stepping into a vacuum. I held my breath, waiting for relief. It didn't come. Instead, the thump continued faint now, but unmistakable, no longer confined to the equipment. It vibrated through the desk, the floor, the very air in the room, as if the station itself had taken over the task of listening. I pulled the power on the main console. Screens went dark one by one, their after images lingering on my retinas. The hum of the fans died, leaving only the wind and that low, steady pulse. I backed away slowly, my boots scraping against the concrete floor. The rhythm didn't change. It didn't need the electronics anymore. That was when I understood the interference reports. Rangers across the park hadn't been hearing random noise. They'd been hearing themselves, reflected back at a distance so slight it slipped past conscious recognition. A breath here, a heartbeat there. The station wasn't broadcasting. It was mirroring, picking up the most basic signs of life and amplifying them just enough to be noticed. I pressed my palm flat against my chest, feeling my heart race under my ribs. The pulse in the room surged to match, swelling until it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Panic threatened to take over, sharp and bright, but I forced it down. Panic feeds rhythms. It accelerates them. If this thing was learning me, I needed to become unpredictable. I slowed my breathing deliberately, then sped it up without warning. The pulse hesitated, lagging behind by a beat. A tiny victory. I held my breath entirely, lungs burning, counting the seconds in my head. The rhythm faltered, stretched thin, then stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and total. No wind, no vibration. Even the faint creaks of the building settling seemed to freeze in place. My vision tunneled, black spots dancing at the edges as oxygen deprivation set in. Just as the urge to gasp became unbearable, the pulse returned soft, coaxing, steady, and I sucked in air greedily. The pulse swelled in response, stronger than before. I staggered back, catching myself against the wall. The realization landed with sickening clarity. Holding my breath didn't stop the signal. It starved it. And starvation, I suspected, made it desperate. The radio crackled again, despite being powered down. My voice returned, closer now, more confident. "You're doing great," it said gently. "Just keep breathing. Let it happen." My stomach lurched. The tone was wrong. Too intimate. Too familiar in a way that bypassed sound and went straight for memory. It was the voice I used when talking someone down from a ledge, when calming lost hikers or frightened kids. Hearing it directed at me felt like a violation, as if the station had reached inside and selected the most effective tool. I edged toward the door, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. Each step sent a tremor through the building, the pulse adjusting to my movement, syncing now not just with my heart but with the cadence of my walk. I changed pace abruptly, stumbling on purpose. The rhythm stumbled too, correcting itself with a slight delay. It was still learning. That meant it wasn't finished. My hand closed around the door handle. Cold, metal, solid, real. I twisted and pulled. The door didn't budge. I tried again. Harder this time. Muscles straining. The handle rattled uselessly, locked from the outside. I knew, distantly, that this wasn't possible. The station had no automatic locks, no security system capable of this. But the logic of the place was shifting, bending to accommodate whatever feedback loop had been completed here. The pulse grew louder, filling the room, overlapping with a second, fainter rhythm that crept in at the edges. Not another echo of me. Something slower, deeper. I felt it in my teeth, in the bones of my wrists, a presence that dwarfed my own small, frantic heartbeat. The station wasn't just listening anymore. It was relaying. I slid down the wall, back pressed against the cold concrete, and closed my eyes. If sight was the last thing it needed, I wasn't going to give it that. I focused inward instead, on disrupting my own patterns. I counted backward in prime numbers, recited fragments of songs out of order, anything to fracture the steady rise and fall of my breath. The pulse wavered, the two rhythms drifting apart slightly. The voice sharpened, losing its calm. "Don't do that," it said, irritation seeping through the familiar tone. "You're making it harder. Harder for who?" The question surfaced unbidden, and with it, a dangerous spark of curiosity. I pushed it down immediately. Curiosity is how feedback loops close. I forced my breathing into a jagged pattern, short, shallow gasps, followed by long, held exhales. The pulse struggled to keep up, stuttering, the deeper rhythm pressing in closer as if to compensate. The walls seemed to contract, the room shrinking around me, the air thick and warm like a body too close for comfort. The window behind me rattled violently now, glass bowing inward. I felt a sudden, overwhelming certainty that if it broke, if the barrier between inside and outside failed, whatever was synchronizing with me would have a clearer path. Not physically, conceptually. I scrambled to my feet and lunged for the emergency breaker near the door, slamming my fist into it. The lights flickered back to life, bathing the room in harsh fluorescence. The pulse faltered, thrown off by the sudden surge of power. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I grabbed my bag and slammed my shoulder into the door, putting my full weight behind it. The lock gave with a sharp crack, and the door flew open, spilling me into the cold, thin air outside. I stumbled onto the gravel, sucking in breath after breath, my heart hammering wildly. Behind me, the station loomed silent and dark, the window intact, the door hanging crookedly on its hinges. For a long moment, nothing happened. No pulse, no voice, just wind and distance. and the fragile relief of being somewhere else. Then my radio crackled softly at my hip. Not words, not static, just a familiar, steady thump, matching my heartbeat exactly, carrying on long after I'd stepped away from the equipment that had first taught it how to listen. The road down the mountain should have felt like escape. Gravity alone promised momentum, the simple physics of distance pulling me away from the station and whatever feedback loop I'd tripped inside it. I kept the headlights low and steady, hands locked at 10 and 2, breathing in sharp, controlled pulls that I hoped would break the pattern before it could settle again. The trees blurred past in dark, vertical lines, trunks flashing white and gone, a metronome of motion I refused to fall into. The radio was off. I'd made sure of that. Power switch down. Volume zeroed. I drove in a cocoon of mechanical noise, the engine's low growl, the whisper of tires on asphalt, the wind threading through cracked seals. For a few miles, it worked. The pulse faded to a memory, the pressure in my chest easing as the air thinned and cooled. I started to believe that distance mattered after all. Then the dashboard clock blinked, just once. A quick, nervous flash like an eye twitching in sleep. The time didn't change. No error code. Nothing to justify the spike of dread that followed. I tightened my grip and focused on the road. Fog pooled in the low spots, rolling across the asphalt in slow, deliberate waves. I adjusted my breathing to match the curves, inhale on the straightaways, exhale through the turns, anything to keep my body from finding its own steady rhythm. The first thump came through the floorboard, so faint I almost missed it. A soft, damp percussion that felt more than it sounded, traveling up through the pedals and into my feet. I lifted my foot off the gas, coasting. The thump continued, now clearly independent of the engine. I swallowed and told myself it was the suspension, the road surface, some quirk of vibration I'd notice on any other night and forget by morning. It came again. 3 quick pulses, a pause, 1 longer beat. I exhaled too fast, the sound tearing out of me, and the pulse swelled in response. The realization hit with brutal clarity. It wasn't tied to the station anymore. It was tied to me. The frequency had learned my baseline and carried it along, a portable echo that didn't need wires or towers to propagate. I was the antenna now. I slowed my breathing, then sped it up, then stopped entirely for as long as my lungs would allow. The pulse lagged, hesitated, then corrected, finding me again with unsettling ease. My chest tightened, panic blooming hot and bright, and the rhythm surged, feeding on it. I cursed aloud, the sound ripped thin by fear, and the thump answered with a sharper resonance, as if acknowledging the exchange. The road curved sharply, trees closing in on both sides, and for a split second my headlights caught movement ahead just beyond the reach of the beams. Not an animal. Too upright. Too still. I slammed the brakes, heart hammering, and the pulse roared, filling the cab with pressure that made my ears ring. The shape vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by fog and shadow. I sat there, foot shaking on the brake, counting backward in my head, forcing my breath into erratic patterns. Slowly, the pressure eased, the pulse softened, receding to a background thrum that hovered just below conscious hearing. I eased the car forward again, every sense stretched tight, scanning the edges of the road for signs of pursuit. That was when the voice returned, not through the radio, not through any speaker I could shut off. It rose from the space, just behind my thoughts, perfectly aligned with the rhythm, calm, familiar. "Mine, you're almost there," it said softly. "Just keep going. Don't break the pattern now." I laughed, a brittle sound that surprised me with its volume. "No," I said aloud, addressing the empty cab, the road, the frequency itself. "You don't get to come with me." The words felt thin, insufficient, but speaking them helped. It introduced noise into a system that thrived on order. The voice paused, as if considering. The pulse wavered, the longer beat stretching uncomfortably before snapping back into place. "Distance doesn't change resonance," it replied, the certainty in the tone chilling. "You already proved that." So. The fog thickened as I descended, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the white. My sense of direction warped, curves repeating in a way that made the road feel longer than it should have been. I checked the mile markers obsessively, clinging to numbers as anchors. They passed, slow but steady. I was moving. I wasn't trapped. At the next turnout, I pulled over hard, tires crunching on gravel, and killed the engine. Silence rushed in, broken only by my ragged breathing and the faint hiss of cooling metal. The pulse persisted, steady and insistent, now accompanied by a subtle pressure behind my eyes. I closed them and focused inward, searching for the edge of it, the boundary between my body and the echo it had learned to wear. I thought of the station then, of the way the equipment had mirrored me before I ever realized what was happening. It hadn't created the rhythm, it had found it, amplified it, reflected it back until it was impossible to ignore. The thought brought a fragile clarity with it. If this thing needed me to maintain coherence, needed my steady breath, my predictable pulse, then unpredictability wasn't just resistance, it was erasure. I did the opposite of everything my body wanted. I laughed too loud, then fell abruptly silent. I breathed in sharp, uneven gulps, and forced myself to hold until my vision blurred. I tapped my fingers against the steering wheel in irregular patterns, disrupting the metronome of motion. The pulse stuttered, struggling to align, the voice losing its smooth cadence as it tried to keep up. "Stop," it said, irritation bleeding through the calm. "You're degrading the signal." "Good," I whispered, a grim smile tugging at my mouth. I pushed harder, letting my thoughts scatter, refusing the comfort of rhythm. The pressure receded, the thump weakening, dissolving into an arrhythmic flutter that felt less like a heartbeat and more like static trying and failing to organize itself. When I finally started the engine again, the road felt different. Still dark, still fog-bound, but quieter, as if something had been left behind in the turnout, stranded without a carrier. The pulse didn't vanish entirely, it never did, but it fell out of sync, reduced to a faint, easily ignored echo that no longer anticipated my movements. I reached the base of the mountain just before dawn. The fog thinned, light seeping into the world in pale washes of gray and blue. As the road leveled out, I felt the last threads of that borrowed rhythm slip loose, snapping back toward the heights they belonged to. The relief was sharp enough to make my hands shake. Later, when I filed the report, I kept it simple. Interference traced to obsolete equipment. Issue resolved by decommissioning the station. No mention of echoes or heartbeats or voices that knew my breathing better than I did. Some truths only gained strength when spoken, and I wasn't willing to give this one a clearer signal. Even now, though, I drive with the radio off, and on certain nights, when the fog settles low and the road hums just right, I swear I can feel a faint, searching pulse in the floorboard, out of sync, frustrated, waiting for a rhythm willing to carry it the rest of the way home. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It thinned in layers, like fog lifting reluctantly from a valley, leaving behind pockets where sound should have been but wasn't. After I reached the lowlands, after the sky began to pale and the world remembered how to look ordinary again, I expected relief. What I got instead was absence, an interval where nothing answered back. No echo, no pulse, no pressure, just my own breathing, uneven and too loud, filling the car as if it were the only sound left in the world. That should have been enough. Distance, daylight, motion, these are the things we trust to close loops. I drove straight to the nearest ranger outpost and sat in the parking lot long after the engine cooled, waiting for the familiar thump to creep back in through the floorboard. It didn't. The radio stayed quiet. The air stayed still. When I finally stepped out of the car, the ground felt inert beneath my boots, unresponsive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I slept for nearly 12 hours after that, the kind of sleep that feels less like rest and more like collapse. No dreams, no rhythm, waiting at the edge of consciousness. When I woke, it was to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and unremarkable, a private thing again. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, cataloging the ordinary noises of the building, the tick of cooling pipes, distant footsteps in the hall, each one a small reassurance. The report I filed was accepted without comment. The station was officially decommissioned, its equipment slated for removal when funding allowed. Interference complaints dropped off entirely. Life, it seemed, had resumed its predictable patterns. I let myself believe that whatever I'd disrupted on that mountain had been too fragile to survive without a carrier. That belief lasted 3 days. It started with the gaps. Moments when sound should have continued but didn't. A colleague's sentence trailing off into nothing. The last word swallowed as if it had never been spoken. The hum of fluorescent lights cutting out for a heartbeat before resuming. No flicker. No explanation. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. Stress has a way of punching holes in perception, leaving you grasping at continuity that isn't quite there. Then the intervals began to lengthen. I noticed it one evening while sitting alone in the outpost. Paperwork spread across the desk. I'd been tapping my pen absently. A soft, irregular click against the wood. Mid-tap, the sound vanished. Not faded, not muffled. Gone. I froze. Pen hovering inches above the desk, ears straining. The room felt pressurized, sealed, as if I'd slipped underwater without the courtesy of a splash. When the sound returned, it did so abruptly, the pen striking wood with a sharp crack that made me flinch. My heart raced, and with it came a familiar dread. I slowed my breathing, fighting the urge to listen too closely, to test the silence. The intervals didn't repeat immediately. They waited. That night, alone in my room, I lay awake and listened to the building breathe. Each inhale of the heating system, each exhale through the vents, formed a comforting, if mechanical, rhythm. I focused on it, letting it anchor me. Somewhere near midnight, the sound stopped. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural, long enough for my pulse to stutter in confusion. Then the system kicked back on, oblivious to the way my hands trembled beneath the sheets. The next day, I reviewed old interference logs from other parks, places with high elevation, thin air, and outdated relay stations. The pattern was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Reports of dropped calls, dead air where transmissions should have been. Operators describing the sensation of being listened to during long shifts alone. In the margins of one report, written in a cramped, hurried hand, was a note that made my stomach drop. Silence behaves like a response if you wait long enough. I began to understand then. The frequency hadn't followed me intact. It had fragmented, shedding coherence as I disrupted its rhythm. What remained wasn't a signal in the traditional sense. It was a capacity, a readiness to receive. The station on the mountain hadn't created it. It had merely focused it, given it shape. Without that focus, it diffused, slipping into the spaces between sounds, waiting for someone, anyone, to supply a pattern strong enough to organize it again. I tested the theory reluctantly. Alone, late at night, I sat in a quiet room and controlled my breathing, slow and steady. I counted heartbeats, letting them settle into a predictable cadence. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the air thickened. The silence pressed closer, attentive, the intervals between ambient sounds stretching just a little too long. I broke the pattern immediately, standing up, pacing, introducing noise and irregularity. The pressure receded, leaving behind only the echo of my own fear. After that, I avoided quiet. I slept with the fan on, the television murmuring softly through the night. I drove with the windows cracked, letting wind noise disrupt any accidental rhythms. It worked, mostly. The intervals shortened, became less frequent. The silence learned to keep its distance, but it never left entirely. Sometimes, in the early hours when the world holds its breath between night and morning, I feel it again, a pause that lasts a fraction longer than it should, a sense of attention sharpening in the absence of sound. In those moments, I remember the station, the way the equipment had leaned into my pulse, eager and precise. I remember the voice that wore my cadence so easily. I've stopped trying to explain it. Explanation implies containment, and this thing doesn't respect boundaries the way we understand them. It doesn't need towers or wires or even mountains. It needs only a steady rhythm and the patience to wait for someone alone enough to provide it. That's the part that keeps me awake now. Not fear of being followed, but the knowledge that silence itself can listen, and that somewhere, in the long intervals where nothing answers, something is still learning how to hear. I stopped trusting meters long before I learned what zero really meant. It began with the sleep monitor. The department issued after a string of fatigue-related incidents. A simple device, wrist-worn, meant to track rest cycles and flag dangerous patterns. It displayed heart rate, respiration, and a neat little graph that dipped when you entered deep sleep. Reassuring. Objective. I wore it because it was easier than explaining why I didn't sleep in silence anymore. For the first few nights, it behaved exactly as advertised. Then, one morning, I woke to find a blank stretch in the data. Not a dip, not an error message, just a flat, unmarked gap where several minutes should have been. The device showed my vitals before and after, steady and unremarkable. But in between there was nothing, no record, no noise, as if the monitor had stopped listening entirely. I told myself it was a glitch. The gaps started appearing elsewhere after that, in recordings, in logs, in conversations I couldn't quite reconstruct afterward. A colleague asked if I'd heard him knocking the night before. I hadn't. The security camera outside my quarters showed me sitting up in bed at 3:17 a.m., eyes open, unmoving, while the hallway lights flickered and then stabilized. The timestamp jumped forward exactly 30 seconds with no explanation. 30 seconds isn't long, not enough to matter, not enough to panic over, but it was long enough for something to align. I became careful after that. Not paranoid careful. I avoided steady rhythms, kept my days uneven, my nights noisy. I learned to spot the early signs of an interval forming. The way ambient sound thinned, the subtle pressure behind the eyes, the feeling that the world was waiting for me to continue something I hadn't knowingly started. When it happened, I disrupted it immediately, coughed, moved, spoke nonsense aloud just to break the shape of my own breathing. It worked until the night it didn't. I was alone in the outpost. Late again. Paperwork spread thin under a single desk lamp. The building had settled into its usual nocturnal hush, fans humming, distant wind nudging the eaves. I was tired enough to forget myself, tired enough to fall into the old habit of breathing slow and deep. I didn't notice the quiet changing at first. It crept in gradually, the way snow muffles a city without anyone hearing it arrive. The fan cut out, not abruptly. It wound down, each rotation slower than the last, until the hum stretched thin and vanished. I looked up, annoyed, already reaching for the switch, then stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had texture, weight. It pressed inward, compressing the space around me until the lamp's light felt too sharp, too isolated. I checked my pulse out of reflex. Too steady. On the desk, the digital recorder I used for notes flickered to life. No button press, no prompt, just a soft glow and a single number on the screen. 30. I stood up too fast, chair scraping loudly across the floor. The sound landed wrong, flattened, as if it had nowhere to go. The number ticked down. 29. 28. Each change was silent, perfectly timed. A rhythm that didn't need sound to enforce itself. I backed away from the desk, heart beginning to race, and the countdown stuttered. 27. 27. 26. A delay. A correction. It was adjusting to me again. I forced my breathing into chaos, short gasps, long holds. Anything to break the pattern, but the numbers kept falling, smoothing themselves out as if learning a new cadence on the fly. I understood then what the station had been. Not a source, a training ground. A place where the silence learned how to keep time. The lamp flickered. The edges of the room softened, details blurring, as if the world were being compressed into something smaller, more manageable. The recorder hit 15, and the pressure behind my eyes became a sharp, insistent ache. I felt watched, not from any direction I could point to, but from the gaps between moments, from the spaces where continuity frayed. "Stop," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and distant. The word didn't echo. It didn't even fade. It simply ceased to exist the instant after I spoke it. Sure, I lunged for the door, every instinct screaming to move, to refuse the center of whatever was forming. The handle turned in my grip. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp and real, carrying the smells of wet earth and pine. Relief surged, and the countdown paused. The number 7 hovered on the screen. Unmoving. Waiting. The voice returned then, Not from the recorder, not from the room, but from the exact center of my awareness. Calm, familiar, patient. You don't need to be afraid, it said. This part doesn't hurt. It just listens. The next lead bangs. I slammed the door shut and crossed the room in 3 strides, ripping the recorder from the desk and hurling it against the concrete wall. It shattered, plastic and circuitry scattering across the floor. The lamp went out. Darkness rushed in, thick and immediate. For a heartbeat, maybe 2, there was nothing. Then the building exhaled. Sound rushed back all at once. Wind, distant insects, the low hum of power returning to the fan. I stood there in the dark, chest heaving, hands shaking, waiting for the pressure to close in again. It didn't. The silence retreated, leaving behind only the ordinary quiet of night. I didn't sleep after that. I packed my things before dawn and filed for an immediate transfer, no explanations given, none requested. The broken recorder was logged as an equipment failure. The missing data went unremarked. 30 seconds is easy to lose. People misplace more than that every day. I live in noise now. Cities help. So do old buildings with unreliable pipes and traffic that never quite stops. I keep a radio on at night, tuned between stations, the soft hiss a comfort. Static is unpredictable. It resists patterns. But sometimes, rarely, I catch myself holding my breath without meaning to. In elevators, in quiet rooms, in the split second before sleep takes me. When that happens, I feel it again. The interval stretching. The world waiting to see if I'll provide a rhythm worth keeping. If you ever find yourself alone with a device counting down in silence, do yourself a favor. Don't try to listen. Don't try to understand. Break the pattern. Make noise. Move. And whatever you do, don't look at the meter when it reaches 0, because 0 isn't an end. It's the moment the silence finishes learning you. Story 3. The forest was already wrong before we noticed it moving. That was the thought that came back to me later, long after the investigation reports were sealed and the site was quietly removed from updated trail maps. At the time, standing at the edge of the burned zone with the smell of char still lingering in the air, it felt like nothing more than a scar. One of many left behind by lightning storms that roll through these mountains every summer. Blackened trunks stood where living pines had been, stripped of needles, stripped of sound. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through them. The family arrived just before dusk. 4 of them, a father, a mother, 2 children old enough to carry their own packs but young enough to trust the world implicitly. They checked in at the ranger station with smiles, asking about secluded campsites, places without crowds or cell reception. The father joked about wanting to show his kids real wilderness, the kind you don't find on postcards. I remember the way his hand rested on the counter, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm while he spoke, as if some part of him already sensed the quiet pressing in around that place. I told them about the burn zone. I told them it was safe, technically true. The fire had passed through years ago, leaving behind a stand of dead pines that still held their ground, bleached gray by sun and ash. The trail cut cleanly through it, and the soil had cooled long ago. I mentioned the lack of shade, the eerie stillness, the way sound behaved strangely there. I didn't tell them how even seasoned rangers avoided camping inside the burn perimeter after dark. Some warnings don't sound reasonable when spoken aloud. They set up their tent near the center of the clearing, where the trees stood far enough apart to let moonlight spill freely onto the ground. The soil was packed hard, pale with ash, and the remains of old lightning scars zigzagged up the trunks like frozen veins. When the sun dipped below the ridge, the temperature dropped fast. The mother zipped her jacket higher and laughed softly, remarking on how quiet it was. No insects, no birds, just the faint creak of wood as the dead trees cooled. The first shift happened sometime after nightfall. The children noticed it first, of course. They always do. The younger one asked why the trees looked closer than before. The father smiled and said it was just the dark playing tricks, shadows stretching in unfamiliar ways. He turned on his headlamp and swept the beam around the clearing. The light caught the trunks at different angles, revealing their uneven spacing. The way some leaned slightly, others stood too straight to feel natural. When he turned the lamp off, the forest felt tighter, not by much. A step, maybe 2, the kind of change you could argue away if you wanted to. And they did. They roasted their food, told stories, tried to laugh at the way sound seemed to die a few feet beyond the tent. The fire crackled, the only thing in the clearing willing to make noise, and even that seemed muted, its warmth swallowed quickly by the ash-colored ground. Later, as the fire burned low, the mother stepped away from the tent to stretch. She took 3 steps toward the nearest tree, then stopped. The distance was wrong. The trunk loomed closer than she remembered, its surface rough and fissured. The bark burned away to reveal pale wood beneath. She reached out without thinking, fingertips brushing the surface. It was warm, not residual heat from the fire, something deeper, steadier. She pulled her hand back quickly, rubbing her fingers together as if the sensation might linger. When she turned toward the tent, the clearing seemed smaller still. The trees hadn't rushed in. They'd adjusted. They went to sleep uneasy, the tent walls thin and unconvincing against the silence. The father lay awake longest, listening to the forest settle. Every so often, he thought he heard movement, not footsteps, not the sound of animals, but a subtle shift, like wood flexing under slow pressure. He told himself it was temperature change, trunks contracting as the night cooled, a rational explanation for a rational man. Sometime after midnight, the forest completed its first deliberate move. The father woke to a sound that didn't belong, a soft, fibrous scrape, repeated in irregular intervals. He held his breath and listened. The sound came again, closer now, followed by another from a different direction. The children stirred beside him, their sleep restless. He reached for his headlamp and flicked it on. The beam illuminated the nearest tree. It stood less than a meter from the tent wall. He was certain, absolutely certain, that it had been farther away when they went to sleep. He remembered pacing the clearing, counting steps, checking distances out of habit. This wasn't misremembering. This was encroachment. He unzipped the tent and stepped out, boots crunching softly against the ash. The air felt thick, resistant, as if the forest were holding its breath. He turned in a slow circle, sweeping the light across the clearing. Every tree stood closer than before, their spacing no longer random but subtly intentional, forming angles that drew the eye inward. Geometry, that was the word that surfaced unbidden. The arrangement wasn't organic. It wasn't the chaotic scatter of nature reclaiming burned land. The trunks aligned in repeating shapes, triangles, incomplete squares, lines that intersected and broke apart just before forming anything recognizable. A pattern that suggested order without ever fully revealing it. Behind him, the tent rustled. The mother whispered his name, tension threading her voice. He turned back toward them, heart pounding, and that's when he saw the ground. Footprints, not theirs. Narrow impressions pressed into the ash between the trees, forming a rough perimeter around the tent. They weren't deep, but they were fresh, their edges crisp in the pale soil. They faced inward. He took a step back, then another, bumping into the tent. The forest responded immediately. A low creak rippled through the trunks, wood shifting against wood, and the clearing tightened by another fraction. Enough to notice, enough to confirm that this was no accident. The children began to cry softly, sensing the change even without understanding it. The father swallowed hard and raised his voice, calling out into the trees, demanding an answer he knew wouldn't come. The sound traveled only a few meters before collapsing into the ash, smothered. Above them, the moon slid behind a thin veil of cloud, and the clearing dimmed. In the half-light, the geometry of the forest became clearer and far more deliberate. The trees weren't just moving closer. They were making room. The father understood, in that quiet and terrible way understanding sometimes arrives, that panic would only teach the forest how to move faster. He lowered his voice first, then his body, crouching so the beam of his headlamp skimmed the ground instead of cutting through the trees. Light, he sensed, mattered here. Attention mattered. The clearing felt like a diagram drawn in negative space, and every deliberate act was another line added to it. He ushered the children back inside the tent without argument. They obeyed too quickly, eyes wide, hands clutching their sleeping bags, as if instinct had already taken over where logic failed. The mother followed last, pausing at the zipper, listening to the soft creak of wood tightening around them. When she sealed the tent, the sound changed. Not louder, closer, as if the trees had been waiting for that exact moment to resume. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of nylon and ash. The father whispered, telling them to stay still, to breathe slowly. He counted under his breath, 1, 2, 3, trying to impose order where none existed. The counting helped him. It did not help the forest. The creak came again, synchronized now, a collective sound that rippled through the trunks like a slow exhale. The tent fabric brushed softly against bark where there should have been empty space. The geometry tightened, angles collapsing inward. The father felt sweat beat along his spine despite the cold. He reached for the axe. It had seemed like an afterthought when he packed it. Extra weight justified by vague notions of preparedness. Now it lay across his knees like a question he didn't want to answer. He unzipped the tent just enough to slip out, careful not to let the fabric snap or scrape. The clearing greeted him with its new dimensions, the nearest trunks looming close enough to touch. He chose one at random. No, not random. One that felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The first strike rang out sharper than he expected. The sound didn't echo. It was absorbed, swallowed by the ash-coated ground and the waiting trees. The axe bit deep into the pale wood, and the father recoiled as something dark welled up from the wound. Blood, not sap, not resin. Thick, red, and unmistakably human. It oozed slowly down the trunk, steaming faintly where it touched the still warm ground. The smell hit him a second later, iron and heat, layered over the char and sulfur. He stumbled back, heart pounding, the axe slipping from his numbing fingers. The forest reacted instantly. The creak deepened, becoming a low, resonant groan that vibrated through the air and into his chest. The trunks shifted again, not rushing, not jerking, but sliding with deliberate care. The angles of the clearing sharpened, lines aligning with sudden clarity. The father realized then that the geometry wasn't just forming shapes. It was measuring. A sound drifted through the trees, carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was just the breeze threading through dead branches. Then it resolved into something else, a whispering cadence that rose and fell, too structured to be natural. He strained to understand it, and that was his second mistake. The forest was counting, not aloud, not in any language he recognized, but he felt it in the way the whispers paused, resumed, adjusted, in the way the trees seemed to lean in, as if listening for confirmation. The clearing pulsed with a terrible patience, waiting for a number to be reached. He scrambled back into the tent, slamming the zipper shut behind him. The mother saw the blood on his hands and went very still. He shook his head, a sharp, desperate gesture that said, "Don't ask." Outside, the whispering continued, growing more confident, more assured. The tent walls pressed inward as the trunks closed ranks, bark brushing fabric with soft, intimate sounds. The children began to sob despite their efforts to stay quiet. Each sound seemed to ripple outward, the whispers adjusting in response. The father wrapped his arms around them, pulling them close, trying to make them smaller, quieter. He felt the forest lean closer, attentive, learning the shape of their fear. Then the counting stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. It stretched, heavy and expectant, like the pause before an answer you don't want to hear. The father's breath came shallow and fast. He forced himself to slow it, to break whatever rhythm the forest had been following. For a moment, nothing happened. A new sound emerged instead. A single knock, not loud, not violent. Just a firm, deliberate tap against the trunk nearest the tent. Then another, from a different direction. Then a third. The pattern was unmistakable, even if the meaning wasn't. The knocks formed a shape in the air, an outline the father could almost see if he tried hard enough. 4. The realization hit him with nauseating force. 4 people, 4 positions in the clearing, 4 shapes waiting to be filled. The geometry wasn't random at all. It was incomplete. The mother understood at the same moment he did. Their eyes met in the dim light, a silent exchange of terror and comprehension. She shook her head, tears streaking her face, mouthing no over and over again. Outside, the trees shifted, tightening the angles, making the space inside the tent smaller, more suffocating. Another knock. Louder this time, closer, The father pressed his forehead to the tent wall, eyes squeezed shut, thoughts racing. He searched for alternatives. Fire, noise, running, but each idea collapsed under the weight of the forest's patience. This place had burned before and still stood. It had waited years for this configuration, this exact number of witnesses. It would wait longer if it had to. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. The counting resumed, slower, more deliberate, as if offering time to decide. The children clung to him, their small bodies trembling. The geometry held, suspended, every angle locked in place. Somewhere, deep in the burned soil beneath them, the ground warmed. The father realized something then that felt colder than fear, colder even than despair. The forest was no longer asking if, it was asking which. The whispers no longer drifted aimlessly between the trunks. They converged, threading themselves into a single, low murmur that pressed against the tent from every side. Not words, never words, but an agreement, reached slowly and with great care. The geometry tightened one final increment, the angles locking into place with a sound like joints settling after a long strain. The clearing was complete now. All that remained was to name the empty space at its center. The knocks stopped. In their place came footsteps, slow, deliberate, not approaching from outside the ring, but circling it, tracing the invisible lines the trees had drawn. Each step landed with a soft, fibrous sound, like wood compressing under weight. The father's breath caught in his throat. He understood with brutal clarity that whatever moved out there did not belong to a single body. It belonged to the pattern itself, borrowing motion where it needed it. The mother squeezed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve hard enough to hurt. Her eyes flicked toward the children, then back to him. There was a question there she could not bring herself to shape. He shook his head again, more weakly this time. Denial had lost its sharp edges, worn down by the forest's patience. Outside, the footsteps paused. The silence that followed was precise, measured, a waiting silence, the kind that doesn't rush because it knows the answer will arrive on its own. The father felt the ground beneath the tent shift, not collapsing, not breaking, settling. The earth accepted the shape drawn above it, warming slightly, as if preparing to hold something for a long time. The younger child whimpered. The sound was small, fragile, and it echoed far too clearly in the clearing. The whispers surged in response, the geometry responding instantly, lines tightening, angles brightening in the father's mind until he could almost see them overlaid on the darkness. 4 points, one center. The math was simple. The forest liked simple things. He did the only thing left to him. He unzipped the tent. The sound cut through the whispers like a blade. The footsteps halted. The geometry held its breath. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of ash and old lightning scars. The father stepped out slowly, every movement deliberate, careful not to stumble into panic. He stood at the edge of the clearing, axe still lying where he dropped it, dark with drying blood. The trees leaned in, not rushing, never rushing. They adjusted, making space not for escape, but for placement. The father felt the pull then, not physical but positional, a subtle pressure guiding him toward the center of the ring. He resisted for a moment, then understood resistance was unnecessary. The geometry did not need force. It needed compliance. Behind him, the mother sobbed quietly, one hand clamped over her mouth to keep the sound from carrying. The children called his name once, voices thin and breaking. He did not turn. Turning would have added another line to the shape, another variable the forest would account for. He kept his eyes on the ground and walked. Each step felt heavier than the last, the soil warming beneath his boots, softening just enough to remember him. When he reached the center, the whispers fell silent all at once. The stillness that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound that pressed inward until even his thoughts felt too loud. He stopped. The forest completed the count. There was no pain at first, just a sensation of fitting, of alignment snapping into place after a long search. The ground shifted beneath him, not downward but inward, closing gently around his boots, his ankles, his calves. He felt the warmth climb, steady and enveloping, like a slow immersion in hot water. Panic flared too late to matter. The mother screamed then, a raw, tearing sound that shattered the silence. The geometry shuddered, lines wavering, but it did not break. The forest had what it needed. The ground rose, or perhaps he sank until the warmth reached his chest. His breath came in sharp, burning pulls, each one shorter than the last. He thought, distantly, of the axe, of the blood in the tree, of how quickly the forest had answered that offering. He wondered if it remembered the names of the others who had stood here before him, if names mattered once the shape was complete. As the warmth reached his throat, he realized the answer with sudden, terrible clarity. The forest did not remember names. It remembered forms. The whispers returned, softer now, satisfied. The ground sealed over the last of him with a gentle sigh, the surface smoothing itself as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The warmth receded, the geometry relaxing, lines dissolving back into organic chaos. The clearing expanded by a fraction, enough to feel spacious again. The mother dragged the children from the tent at dawn, hands numb, mind blank, guided only by the sudden, unnatural stillness of the forest. The trees did not follow. They stood where they were, evenly spaced, silent, complete. No footprints marked the center of the clearing, no depression, just a patch of pale ash, undisturbed. By the time the patrol team arrived, the geometry had fully unraveled. The trees stood in their original, random scatter, blackened trunks rising into a harmless blue sky. The tent lay collapsed, abandoned. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no axe. Only one thing was new. At the center of the clearing stood a young pine tree, no more than a few hours old, its needles a vibrant, impossible green against the ash. It grew perfectly straight, its branches arranged with unsettling symmetry. When the wind passed through it, the sound it made was not quite a rustle. It was a count. The patrol reached the clearing just after first light, when the forest wears its most convincing disguise. Dawn softened the burned scars, turning blackened trunks into pale silhouettes and ash into something almost silver. From a distance, the sight looked ordinary, quiet, empty, abandoned the way campsites often are after a cold night. No smoke, no movement, just a ring of dead pines standing at irregular angles, waiting to be misread as natural. Up close, the geometry returned. It wasn't as obvious as it had been at night. In daylight, the mind resists patterns that don't want to be named. Still, every ranger there felt it before anyone said a word. The spacing was wrong. The trees stood too evenly, the clearing too centered, the air too still. Sound behaved oddly, voices flattening as they crossed the space, as if the ground were absorbing them on contact. The tent lay collapsed near the edge of the clearing, fabric slack and cold, stakes pulled cleanly from the ash. No rips, no tears, no signs of panic. Packs were still inside, neatly arranged, food untouched. 4 sleeping bags lay open, empty, aligned as if someone had taken care to leave them that way. It looked less like a struggle and more like a decision that had been finished. They searched anyway. They always do. Boots traced slow circles through the ash, careful not to disturb what little evidence might remain. Radios crackled softly, voices low and professional. One ranger bent to examine the ground where the tent had stood and frowned. There were no footprints leading away, none leading in. Just smooth, pale ash, undisturbed except for a single, subtle change at the center of the clearing. The new growth. 4 young pine trees stood there, no more than shoulder height, arranged in a perfect square where the tent's footprint should have been. Their needles were impossibly green, vibrant against the gray ground, branches angled upward with unnatural precision. They were healthy in a way that felt aggressive, as if they'd skipped years of fragile growth and arrived fully committed to their shape. No one spoke at first. One ranger reached out without thinking and touched the nearest trunk. It was warm, not sun-warm this early. Nothing should have held heat yet. The warmth came from deeper within, steady and contained. He pulled his hand back quickly, rubbing his fingers together as if they might cling to the sensation. Another ranger checked the soil. The ash parted easily beneath his glove, revealing earth that was darker than it should have been, richer, almost loamy. It smelled faintly of iron beneath the char. He straightened slowly and shook his head. These didn't grow overnight. he said, though his voice lacked conviction. They cut one down. The decision was made quickly, quietly, justified by protocol and the need for samples. The saw bit into the trunk with a dry, fibrous sound that carried too far in the still air. When the tree fell, it did so without resistance, landing gently in the ash as if placed there. No sap bled from the cut. No resin. The interior wood was dense and dark, rings tightly packed and perfectly even, each one identical to the last. 4 rings, then 4 more. The count continued, impossibly fast. Years layered on years, growth compressed into something that had learned efficiency. The ranger running the saw shut it off and stepped back, breathing hard. No one suggested cutting the others. They marked the site and left. Officially, the report listed the family as missing, presumed lost due to disorientation in a burned area. The trees were cataloged as anomalous growth, likely the result of unique soil conditions following the fire. The trail was quietly rerouted. Maps were updated. Warning signs went up, citing unstable ground. The forest, on paper, was made safe again. It didn't agree. Over the following weeks, the 4 pines grew faster than any surrounding vegetation, their branches extending outward in subtle, deliberate angles. Saplings nearby withered and died, as if crowded out by an influence that wasn't entirely physical. The dead pines around them shifted slightly, not enough to be noticed unless you returned often, unless you counted steps and angles the way rangers do when something feels off. The whispers came back at night, not loud enough to record, not clear enough to transcribe. Just a low, fibrous murmur that rose and fell with the wind, carrying a cadence that felt uncomfortably like counting. Rangers assigned nearby reported restless sleep, dreams of standing in clearings that felt too exact, too intentional. One mentioned waking with ash on his boots despite never leaving the cabin. The 4 trees were removed in winter, under snow and floodlights, their roots cut free and hauled away. The ground beneath them was left bare, a square of darker soil that refused to freeze completely. In spring, new growth appeared in the same configuration. 4 pines, evenly spaced, vibrant and warm. After that, the decision was made to stop interfering. The clearing was closed entirely, flagged as a long-term recovery zone. Patrols skirted its edges, careful not to linger, careful not to stand still long enough for the forest to notice. Visitors were told the area was unstable, the ground unpredictable. That part, at least, was true. If you stand at the perimeter now, just as the light begins to fade, you can sometimes feel it, the faint sense of alignment tugging at your feet, the urge to step inward and see how the space fits you. The trees stand quietly, patient as ever, their geometry softened but intact. They are not hostile. They do not chase. They wait. Forests don't forget fires. They don't forget lightning, or loss, or the shapes that once stood among them. They remember what fits, what completes the pattern when something is missing. And every so often, when the wind moves just right through the burned trunks and the young pines sway in perfect, synchronized arcs, the sound they make is almost human in its precision. Not a voice, not a scream, just a count. Starting over, slowly, carefully, from 1. Story 4. By the time Ranger Claire Holloway noticed the boots, the sun was already low enough to turn Manzanita Lake into a sheet of dull copper. She had been told, gently and more than once, that dusk patrols around the lake were uneventful to the point of boredom. Flat trails, clear sightlines, families during the day, photographers at golden hour. Nothing that required more than routine presence and a friendly nod. It was supposed to be an easy assignment for a new ranger still learning the rhythms of the park. That was probably why the first detail felt so wrong. The boots were too clean. Claire noticed them at a distance, catching the last light as she rounded a bend in the trail. Polished black leather, gleaming softly against the muted browns and greens of the forest. They stood out, not because they were flashy, but because they refused to belong. The rest of the man was ordinary enough at first glance. Ranger uniform, hat pulled low, posture straight, but the boots held the light in a way that felt deliberate, almost practiced. He stood at the edge of the trail, facing the lake. Claire slowed her pace, instinctively checking her radio, her surroundings. The man didn't turn when she approached, didn't acknowledge her footsteps on gravel. He simply raised one arm and pointed, a single finger extended toward the water's darkening surface. "Sir?" she called, keeping her tone neutral. "The trail closes at sunset." No response. The lake was unnaturally still. No ripples. No birds skimming the surface. The far shore blurred into shadow. The trees reflected so cleanly it was hard to tell where the forest ended and the water began. Claire felt an unexpected chill creep up her arms despite the mild air. She took another step closer. That was when she noticed the uniform. It was wrong in subtle ways, cut a little too stiff, fabric heavier than modern issue. The patch on the shoulder bore an older emblem she'd only seen in archival photos, stitched in a style no longer used. The hat sat lower than regulation, shadowing the man's face completely. "Sir?" she said again, louder now. "I need you to turn around." The man did not move. His arm remained extended, finger unwavering, pointing at a section of water near the center of the lake. Claire followed the line of his gesture despite herself. The surface there looked darker, thicker somehow, as if the lake had depth in layers instead of distance. She swallowed and took a step back. The boots caught the light again. They were spotless. No dust, no mud. Not even the faint scuff marks you'd expect from standing on gravel for more than a few seconds. They looked freshly polished, reflective enough that Claire could see a warped version of herself in them, elongated, stretched, as if the reflection were being pulled downward. "Okay," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "That's enough." She reached out and touched his sleeve. The fabric was cold, not cool from evening air. Cold in the way stone is cold, in the way water feels before your body realizes how deep it goes. Claire jerked her hand back, heart hammering. The man finally moved, then not turning, not stepping away, but lowering his arm in one smooth motion. He pointed again, this time. The finger angled slightly downward, at the water's edge. Claire's radio crackled sharply at her hip, the sudden sound making her flinch. She grabbed it gratefully, thumb hovering over the transmit button. Before she could speak, the crackle cut off, replaced by a low hiss that faded into silence. The radio went dead in her hand. Screen dark. When she looked back up, the man was closer. She was certain he hadn't walked. There'd been no sound, no shift of gravel, no movement she could track. He was simply there now, standing within arm's reach, boots gleaming, presence pressing in like a held breath. She could smell him then. Lake water, old metal, and something else beneath it, a heavy, stagnant scent like mud that has never seen sunlight. "Sir," she whispered, voice betraying her now. "Please step back from the water." End quote. Slowly, deliberately. The man lowered his arm and turned his head just enough for her to see part of his face, or what remained of it. The skin was pale and slack, stretched too tightly over bone, as if it had spent a long time submerged. His eyes were open but unfocused, clouded like glass left underwater too long. His mouth hung slightly ajar, lips tinged a faint, unhealthy blue. Still, he did not speak. He lifted his arm one last time and pointed not at the lake, but at the space behind her. Claire spun around instinctively. The trail was empty. No footprints. No movement. Just the quiet curve of gravel leading back into the trees, already swallowed by shadow. When she turned back, the man was gone. Only the lake remained. The surface rippled once, gently, as if something beneath it had shifted position. The reflection of the trees warped and resettled. At the water's edge, a pair of wet footprints appeared briefly on the gravel, perfectly spaced, leading toward the lake, then stopping short. They began to fade almost immediately. Claire backed away slowly, every nerve screaming, until the trail widened and the trees thinned. She didn't run. Running felt wrong here, like it would attract attention. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back at the water until the lake disappeared behind the bend. That night, in the safety of the station, she filed her report with shaking hands. She described an unidentified individual in an outdated uniform, possible hypothermia victim, possible hallucination due to fatigue. She did not mention the boots. She did not mention the pointing. She did not mention the way the water had seemed to wait. She learned later, quietly, from an older ranger who never met her eyes that a man matching that description had died in the lake decades ago. A ranger from the 1,950 seconds, pulled under while saving a drowning child. His body was never recovered, and they said he still worked the trail at sunset. They said if you saw him, you should never follow where he points, because he isn't warning you about the water. He's showing you where he's still standing. Claire did not dream that night. Or rather, she did not remember dreaming, which felt worse. Sleep came in fragments, shallow, interrupted by the sense that something in the room was adjusting itself to her breathing. When she finally woke, it was to a sound that did not belong to the morning routine of the station. Drip. She lay still, eyes open, listening. The room was dim, early light pressing weakly through the narrow window. The sound came again, steady and patient, striking a surface just out of view. Drip, drip. Not the irregular tapping of a leaky pipe, but something measured, deliberate, as if each drop were being placed. She sat up, slowly. At the foot of her bed, on the bare wooden floor, stood a pair of boots. They were positioned neatly, side by side, toes facing the bed, heels aligned with precise care. Polished black leather, flawless and reflective even in the low light. Water beaded on their surface, gathering at the seams before sliding down to the floor. Beneath them, a small, dark puddle had formed, spreading outward in a thin, uneven halo. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The boots were not hers. They were not issued gear. They were not possible. She swung her legs off the bed, heart hammering, and stood without taking her eyes off them. The air smelled faintly of lake water and cold stone, the same stagnant, metallic scent she'd noticed by the shore. The drip continued, each drop striking the floor with a soft, final sound, as if the boots were slowly emptying themselves. "Okay," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Okay." She reached for her radio on the nightstand. The screen flickered weakly when she pressed the power button, then went dark again. No static, no hiss, just nothing. The silence pressed in, thick and attentive. When she looked back at the boots, the puddle had spread farther than it should have. The water crept across the floor in a thin sheet, flowing not downhill, not toward the door, but toward her. It stopped just short of her bare toes, as if respecting an invisible boundary. She stepped back. The water followed. Claire backed toward the wall, pulse racing, mind scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Condensation. A prank. Sleepwalking. Every idea felt flimsy, paper-thin against the quiet certainty settling in her chest. She grabbed a towel from the chair and tossed it over the boots without thinking. The fabric landed wrong. Too light. It slid off, soaking instantly, hitting the floor with a wet slap. For a brief, terrible moment, Claire thought she saw an outline beneath it, not legs, not a body, but the suggestion of something tall and upright, defined only by the way the water displaced around it. The dripping stopped. The silence deepened. Then, very slowly, the boots turned, not slid, not kicked. They rotated in place, toes angling toward the door. The movement was smooth, controlled, as if guided by an intention that didn't require joints or muscles. When they finished turning, the water began to flow again, this time pulling away from Claire, trailing toward the hallway. The door creaked open. Claire did not remember unlocking it. The hallway beyond was dim, lights still off, shadows pooling along the floor. Wet footprints appeared one by one on the wood, forming between the boots and the doorway. Each print crisp and defined, water soaking into the grain before fading to a dull stain. The boots began to move. They walked, not fast, not slow, at a pace that assumed she would follow. Claire stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, then grabbed her jacket and stepped after them, every instinct screaming not to be alone. The hallway smelled of damp earth now, the scent growing stronger with each step. The boots left the room, turning down the corridor toward the back exit, the one that led to the trail. "Wait," she said, hating the way her voice shook. The word echoed oddly, stretching thin before disappearing altogether. The boots did not pause. She followed them outside into the gray of early morning. Fog clung low to the ground, wrapping the station in a muted hush. The footprints led across the gravel, perfectly spaced, unbroken by missteps or hesitation. They headed away from the lake at first, toward the tree line, as if deliberately misleading her. Claire stopped at the edge of the light. The boots stopped too. They turned once more, slowly, and pointed not with a finger this time, but with their toes back toward Manzanita Lake. The meaning settled over her with chilling clarity. The man she'd seen by the water had not followed her to the station. He had come to finish the walk. The boots waited, water pooling beneath them again, patient and unhurried. Claire felt the pull then, subtle but undeniable. The same positional pressure she'd felt the night before. The trail toward the lake seemed to straighten in her vision, every curve smoothing out, every obstacle fading into irrelevance. She took one step back. The boots did not move. She took another. Still, they waited. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe irregularly, to break the moment before it could settle into rhythm. The fog shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called sharp, abrupt, blessedly alive. The boots hesitated, their polish dulling slightly, as if the light itself had lost interest. She seized the moment and ran not toward the lake, but sideways, breaking the implied line, cutting across the gravel and into the open yard. The footprints behind her wavered, blurring, the water soaking away into nothing. When she looked back, the boots were gone. Only the damp stains remained, already drying in the morning air. Claire reported sick that day. No questions were asked. At dusk, she locked herself in her room and pushed a chair under the handle, every light on, radio hissing softly between stations. She did not sleep. Just before dawn, she heard the sound again. Drip, drip. This time, it came from beneath the bed. By the third night, Claire stopped pretending this was something that could be outwaited. Sleep had become a shallow arrangement, minutes stolen between sounds, each one ending with the same sensation, that she had been considered. Not watched exactly, weighed, measured for fit, the way a path measures a footstep before it commits to being worn down. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the lake at dusk, copper dark and perfectly still, and the boots standing just close enough to catch the light. She went to the records room because it was the only place left that felt anchored to rules. The room sat half buried beneath the station, concrete walls sweating faintly even in winter. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum imperfect, uneven, exactly what she needed. Claire pulled drawers until her fingers ached, paging through brittle reports, incident logs typed on machines that no longer existed, handwritten notes fading into the paper that carried them. She didn't search for his name at first. Names, she'd learned, came later. She searched for the pointing. The pattern surfaced slowly, reluctantly, as if the files themselves resisted being aligned. Rangers reported encounters near Manzanita Lake stretching back decades. A silent colleague in outdated uniform, a gesture toward the water, radios failing within seconds. Each report ended the same way, with uncertainty, with rational explanations strained thin. And then there were the addendums, marginal notes, crossed out sentences that all said some version of the same thing. He appears before drownings. He was seen the night before the child went missing. The pointing may not be a warning. Claire sat back, the chair creaking under her weight, and felt the shape of it settle into place. The man in the polished boots didn't arrive after tragedy. He arrived before. Always just before. She found the photograph last. It was tucked into a thin folder, marked with the year 1956, and a single word written in blue ink: recovery. The photo showed a group of rangers standing by the lake, faces solemn, uniforms stiff. One of them stood slightly apart, boots gleaming unnaturally bright even in the faded image. His posture was perfect, too perfect. His face was blurred, either by motion or by something the camera had failed to understand. On the back of the photo, someone had written, R.H. volunteered. Claire read the report that followed with slow, careful attention. The incident itself was brief. A child fell through thin ice late in the season. Panic. Shouting. A ranger, Richard Holloway, entered the water without hesitation. He reached the child, pushed them up through the break in the ice. Other hands pulled the child free. Richard did not come back up. Search efforts lasted weeks. The lake refused them. Equipment failed. Divers reported disorientation, pressure changes, the sense of being guided away from where they were looking. Eventually, the search was called off. Official cause: presumed drowning, body unrecovered. Unofficially, someone had written a final note at the bottom of the page, small and careful, as if hoping it might be missed. He knew the lake would take one. He chose himself so it wouldn't take more. Claire stared at the words until they blurred. The realization crept in slowly, heavy and unwelcome. The man in the polished boots wasn't luring people to the water. He was intercepting them at the edge of something worse. The pointing wasn't an invitation. It was an accounting, a reminder of where the debt was held. That night, she returned to the lake on purpose. Dusk settled thick and low, fog threading itself between the trees like cautious fingers. Claire walked the trail alone, radio left behind, flashlight off. She wanted the encounter on her terms, as much as that was possible. The water lay still, reflecting the darkening sky with unsettling clarity. She didn't have to wait long. The boots appeared first, as they always did, catching the last light. Then the rest of him resolved from the fog, uniform stiff with age, hat pulled low. He stood at the water's edge, facing the lake. When Claire stepped onto the trail, he turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence. This time, he did not point. "Why me?" Claire asked softly, the words steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I haven't fallen. I haven't gone in." The man raised his arm slowly and pointed not at the water, but at the ground between them. The gravel shifted, just slightly, and Claire felt the same positional pull she'd felt in her room, in the hallway, in her dreams. The lake waited. Yes, but so did the trail behind her. She understood then. He wasn't choosing victims. He was choosing replacements. The lake took one to spare many. It always had. When the balance tipped, when the debt grew too large, someone had to stand in the place where the water reached and say no further. Richard Holloway had done it once. He'd never left, because leaving would break the line. "You're tired," Claire whispered, and she didn't know who she was speaking to, the man, the lake, or the idea of duty that had drawn her here in the first place. "You can't do this forever." For the first time, something changed. The man lowered his arm. The boots dulled, losing their unnatural shine. The water rippled gently, the surface breaking its perfect stillness. The pressure eased, just a fraction, enough for Claire to breathe more freely. He pointed again, not at the lake, at her badge, at the patch on her shoulder. Still bright, still new. The message landed with crushing clarity. He wasn't asking her to drown. He was asking her to stand watch, to take the place beside the water, to be seen when the balance threatened to tip, to point so others wouldn't have to guess. Claire took a step back. The boots did not follow. For a long moment, they stood there, facing each other across the narrowing light, the lake breathing quietly between them. Then the fog thickened, swallowing the man's form piece by piece until only the boots remained, gleaming faintly. They faded last. Claire left the lake before full dark, her steps slow but steady, the pull receding with every uneven breath. She knew then what the older rangers had meant when they said some posts weren't assignments. They were inheritances. She filed for a transfer the next day. The request was approved without comment. But on her final evening, as she packed her things, she found something waiting neatly at the foot of her bed. A pair of boots, not polished, not wet, just standard issue, worn but clean, positioned carefully, toes facing the door, ready for walking. Claire learned very quickly that leaving a place does not always mean you have stopped standing in it. Her last night at the station was quiet in the way that makes you suspicious of your own relief. The boots are boots now, she supposed sat where she'd found them, cleaned and laced, unremarkable in every way that mattered. She told herself they were just leather and stitching, mass-produced and replaceable. Still, she did not move them. Some instincts don't argue with logic. They simply insist. Sleep came reluctantly. When it did, it carried her not to the lake, but to the trail that led away from it, winding through trees that leaned just slightly too far inward. In the dream, the ground felt firm and cooperative beneath her feet, the kind of path that welcomes repetition. She walked until the forest thinned and the light changed, and for a moment she believed she'd escaped the geometry of the place entirely. Then she noticed the silence, not the absence of noise, but the absence of response. Her footsteps made no sound. Her breath left no fog in the cool air. The world accepted her presence without acknowledging it, as if she were a thought passing through someone else's mind. She woke with her heart racing, the echo of water lapping softly at the edge of hearing. At dawn, she packed and left without ceremony. No one walked her out. No one asked why her transfer had been processed so quickly. The road away from Manzanita Lake felt longer than it should have been. The turns familiar yet subtly altered, as if she were driving through a map that had been redrawn overnight. She kept the radio off. She counted irregularly under her breath, breaking any rhythm that tried to settle. For a while, it worked. Her new assignment was inland, far from open water, the landscape dry and angular in ways that felt safe. The days filled themselves with routine trail checks, visitor questions, the small, grounding rituals of work. Nights were harder. She slept with lights on, windows cracked, the hum of a fan disrupting the quiet. She avoided mirrors when she could, not out of fear of seeing something behind her, but because reflections had begun to feel negotiable. The first sign came 2 weeks in. A visitor reported wet footprints in a maintenance hallway that had no plumbing. The prints appeared overnight and faded by morning, evenly spaced, leading toward a locked door that opened onto nothing but a storage room. Claire took the report calmly, professionally, filed it as condensation tracked in by staff. She did not mention the spacing. She did not mention the way the print stopped abruptly, as if the walker had decided to stand still. That night, she found her boots damp, not soaked, not dripping, just faintly wet along the seams. The leather darkened as if it had been set briefly on cool stone. She wiped them down and set them by the door, telling herself it meant nothing. Water travels. Memory travels. The mind fills gaps when it's tired. The dreams returned, subtly altered. She stood beside a lake she didn't recognize, the shoreline unfamiliar, but the feeling instantly known. In the reflection, she saw boots at the edge of the water, sometimes polished, sometimes plain, sometimes hers, sometimes not. Each time, someone stood just out of frame, pointing. She woke with the certainty that she was being checked on. The call came near the end of her first month. A child had slipped near a reservoir at the edge of the district. Nothing dramatic. A scrape. A scare. No injuries. Claire listened to the report with an odd sense of distance, a pressure building behind her eyes as details aligned too neatly. The time, the weather, the way the water had been described as unusually still. She drove out alone. The reservoir lay quiet under a lowering sky, the surface dark and glassy. The trail around it was empty, gravel, undisturbed. Claire stood at the edge and felt the familiar pull, softer than it had been in Manzanita, but unmistakable. The water waited, patient as ever, its hunger not loud but assured. She did not step closer. Instead, she stood where she was and raised her arm. She pointed, not at the water, but along the trail, toward the long, winding path that led back to the parking lot. She held the gesture until her shoulder ached, until the pressure eased, until the surface of the reservoir rippled gently and then broke into ordinary movement. Only then did she lower her arm. The relief that followed was sharp and immediate, a release she hadn't realized she'd been bracing against. Claire laughed softly, the sound thin but real, and turned away. She did not look for boots. She did not look for a man in an outdated uniform. She didn't need to. She understood now. The lake did not need a body. It needed a boundary. Someone willing to stand at the edge and say not today. Someone visible enough to be noticed by the thing beneath the surface, but solid enough not to be pulled under by it. Richard Holloway had been one. Now there was another. Claire went back to her truck and drove away as the light faded, heart steady, breath deliberately uneven. She filed the incident report later that night, concise and unremarkable. Visitor assisted. Area secured. She did not request another transfer. Some evenings, when the water is too still and the air presses close, she feels it again, that positional pull, the quiet expectation. When she does, she puts on her boots and walks the perimeter, her steps careful, her presence deliberate. She points when she must. She turns people away before they realize how close they are to something that remembers how to take. And somewhere, at Manzanita Lake, the polished boots stand a little farther back from the shore than they used to, waiting, watching, relieved. The red folder did not list names on its cover. It never had. Just a date range, written and rewritten over the years in different hands. The ink darkened where someone had pressed too hard. Claire found it on a quiet afternoon, weeks after she'd stopped pretending the role was temporary. It sat in the back of the filing cabinet, thinner than most, heavier than it should have been. When she opened it, the paper inside smelled faintly of lake water and old leather. The entries were brief, clinical, almost careful not to linger. 1,956. R.H. Last sighting confirmed at shoreline. Subject remains on post. 1,973. Reports of pointing resumed. No recovery required. 1,991. Witness diverted. Balance maintained. No explanations. No conclusions. Just confirmations that something had been noticed, acknowledged, and left in place. Claire turned the pages slowly, aware of how the room seemed to quiet around her, as if the building itself were listening for the sound of paper. The final page was blank. She closed the folder and locked it away, understanding without being told that blank pages were invitations. That night, she returned to the water, not to Manzanita Lake this time, but to a smaller, nameless inlet, a few miles from her station. The air was still, the surface smooth enough to mirror the stars. She felt the familiar pressure gather, subtle and insistent, testing whether she would acknowledge it. She did. Claire stood at the edge, boots planted firmly on gravel, and waited. The pressure swelled, then paused, as if recalibrating. Somewhere behind her, a branch snapped. Somewhere farther away, a night bird cried out and went quiet again. She raised her arm and pointed, not sharply, not urgently, but with the calm assurance of someone who knows the path better than the water does. The lake responded the way it always did when the boundary held. A ripple crossed the surface, breaking the reflection into harmless fragments. The pressure eased. The air cooled. When she returned to the station, she wrote the entry herself. One line. No flourish. No signature. Balance maintained. The boots dried by the door overnight. In the morning, they were clean. Not polished. Not wet. Just ready. Claire wore them on patrol and found that they carried her weight easily, as if they'd been broken in by years she couldn't remember. Visitors passed her with smiles and questions, unaware of how close they sometimes stood to edges that had learned patience. Every so often, a report would come in, someone seeing a ranger at dusk who didn't answer, someone noticing footprints that ended too neatly at the waterline. Claire would take those calls herself. She would listen, thank them, and make sure they didn't return after sunset. The pointing, she'd learned, was not a warning meant to frighten. It was a correction, a quiet redirection, before a choice became irreversible. On certain evenings, when the lake lay too still and the sky pressed low, Claire felt a presence beside her. Not behind, beside. A sense of alignment, of shared duty rather than pursuit. She never looked for him. Looking had never been necessary. The boots by the shore were farther back now. The water, content to be watched, did not test the line as often. The red folder remained thin, and somewhere, on trails that curved away from dark water and back toward lighted paths, people felt an inexplicable urge to turn around, an impulse they couldn't name, only obey. They went home believing they'd chosen it themselves. That was the arrangement. If you walk near still water at dusk and see a ranger standing quietly, arm outstretched, don't thank them. Don't ask questions. Just follow the direction they give you and keep moving. Some jobs don't end when the shift does. Some posts are not assignments, but promises. The lakes remember the ones who keep them, and the boots polished or plain are always waiting by the door, in case the boundary needs to be drawn again before night finishes settling in. Story 5. The trail did not exist on any printed map, and that should have been the end of it. Evan noticed the discrepancy first. crouched over the picnic table while the late afternoon light flattened the world into muted grays. The paper map, creased, reliable, annotated with years of other people's certainty, showed nothing where his phone displayed a confident blue line curling away from the main path. No dotted spur, no warning symbol, just a blank, patient stretch of green where the device insisted there was an overlook worth seeing. Mara leaned over his shoulder and squinted at the screen. "Maybe it's new," she said, too casually. New things had a way of smoothing over doubt. The park updates digital layers all the time. The GPS chimed softly, a pleasant sound designed to be trusted. Proceed to the highlighted route. The font was clean, the instruction neutral. Evan felt the faint tug of convenience settle in his chest, the promise of a shortcut. A secret view that wouldn't be crowded. A story you could tell later without sounding reckless. They stepped off the main trail together. At first, nothing protested. The dirt underfoot was compact and cooperative. Pine needles pressed flat into a path that felt recently walked. The trees stood far enough apart to suggest intention. Even the light seemed to cooperate, filtering down in gentle bands that made the way ahead easy to read. Evan checked the paper map again, just to be sure, and laughed at himself. "Guess the map's old," he said, folding it away. The first wrongness arrived quietly. The color drained from the forest without ceremony, as if someone had turned a dial a fraction too far. Greens dulled to olive, then to a tired gray. The sky lost its blue and settled into a uniform, pale wash that felt less like weather and more like a setting. Mara stopped to adjust her pack and frowned. "Is it getting flatter?" she asked, searching for a word that wouldn't sound foolish. Evan followed her gaze. Depth had thinned. The trees ahead looked closer than they should have been, their spacing compressed in a way that made distance hard to judge. He lifted the phone. The blue line pulsed reassuringly, the arrow rotating to align with their direction. "Continue straight." They did. After a few minutes, the sound changed. Not vanished, changed. Footsteps landed without echo, the forest absorbing noise as if it were made of cloth instead of wood and stone. Their voices sounded closer to their own ears than the open air should allow. Evan tried a joke and didn't like how quickly it fell flat. He stopped and turned around. The trail behind them did not look the same way it had 10 steps ago. The entrance had narrowed, the trees on either side leaning just enough to suggest they had been closer all along. The paper map stayed folded in his pocket. He told himself he didn't need it yet. The GPS chimed again, patient. In 200 feet, slight left. They took the left. The ground dipped gently, the slope so mild it felt accommodating. The light thinned further, and with it, color. By the time they reached the bottom, the world had settled into two tones, bone-pale sky and charcoal forest. Even their clothing looked borrowed from an old photograph. Edges softened, contrast exaggerated. Mara stopped breathing for a second without realizing it. Evan noticed because the silence stretched too long between her steps. He slowed his own breath, then quickened it, testing whether the air would answer back. It did, reluctantly. "Okay," he said, trying for steady. "Let's check the map." He pulled the paper free and unfolded it. The page showed the familiar trail, the bend they'd left behind, the comforting certainty of ink that did not move. The place they stood now remained empty. No line, no symbol, no suggestion that anything had ever passed through this space. The phone vibrated in his hand. "Proceed," Mara laughed, sharp and brittle. "It's wrong," she said. "It has to be wrong." Evan's thumb hovered over the back arrow. The interface resisted for half a second, just enough to be noticed, then complied. The screen rotated. The blue line reoriented itself instantly, still pointing forward. "Proceed." He turned in a slow circle. The arrow followed him, correcting smoothly, as if the device were not tracking satellites overhead but him. His chest tightened. "Let's go back," he said, and took a step toward the way they'd come. The ground behind them dropped away, now with drama, now with noise. The path simply ended where the forest should have continued, replaced by a clean, vertical absence that swallowed light without reflection. Evan stopped with his toes inches from the edge, heart hammering. He crouched and extended a trekking pole. The tip vanished into nothing. It did not strike bottom. The GPS chimed, brighter now, recalculating. The arrow swung decisively toward the remaining path. Proceed to destination. Mara pressed her hands to her mouth and laughed again, the sound tearing out of her. "It's hurting us," she whispered. "It's Evan. It's hurting us." The trail ahead narrowed, not closing but agreeing, the trees aligning into a corridor that felt measured. Evan checked the battery full. Signal strong. The device was calm in a way that felt personal. He imagined it dimming the world to make the line easier to follow, stripping away detail until only direction remained. "Don't listen to it," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was addressing. The GPS vibrated once, a gentle reprimand. "Proceed." They walked. The path descended again, this time more steeply, the ground firm and helpful. The air cooled. The light thinned to a colorless glow that made their shadows stretch wrong. Evan counted steps to keep himself anchored, deliberately breaking the rhythm when it tried to settle. Mara clutched his sleeve and stared at the screen as if it might blink first. Ahead, the corridor opened onto a platform of stone that jutted out over the absence. The edge was clean, geometric, too precise to be erosion. Beyond it, the void waited, vast and quiet, a depth without features. The GPS chirped with satisfaction. "You have arrived." A line of text appeared beneath the arrow, small and neat. "Destination, Lassen." Evan felt the words settle in his bones, heavy with meanings he didn't want to unpack. He took the phone in both hands, and with a sudden, desperate resolve, shut it off. The screen went black. The world did not return. The path behind them remained gone. The corridor ahead held. The void breathed, not wind, not sound, but a pressure that suggested attention. Evan's pulse roared in his ears. Mara squeezed his arm hard enough to hurt. Then, from somewhere very close, the GPS chimed again. The screen lit. "Proceed." The first impossible instruction appeared without emphasis, which somehow made it worse. The GPS vibrated once gentle, almost polite, and the arrow rotated 90 degrees to the left. The text beneath it refreshed, the font unchanged, the tone perfectly neutral. "Turn left." The direction pointed directly at a rock wall that rose from the edge of the platform, its surface pale and smooth in the colorless light, unbroken by cracks or holds. Evan stared at it, waiting for the device to correct itself, to apologize in the way machines sometimes do when they realize they've made a mistake. It didn't. Mara shook her head slowly, as if too much movement might trigger something. "It's telling us to walk into it," she said, stating the obvious because sometimes naming the thing keeps it from becoming real. "It wants us to..." She stopped, breath hitching, and laughed once, sharp and brittle. "No. No." Evan backed away from the wall, dragging Mara with him, boots scraping against stone. The arrow followed them, adjusting smoothly, always pointing at the same impossible surface. He turned the phone sideways, upside down, covered the screen with his palm. The vibration came again, a little firmer this time, like a knuckle wrapped against glass. "Turn left." The corridor behind them narrowed by a fraction, not enough to be dramatic, enough to be noticed. The trees leaned in, patient and precise, their branches aligning into a shape that suggested cooperation rather than force. Evan felt the positional pull again, that quiet pressure that said, "This is where you go." The same sensation he'd felt when the path first agreed to exist beneath their feet. He tried something else. He held his breath. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The air stayed thin and cooperative. Then the pressure intensified, a dull ache blooming behind his eyes. The device vibrated twice in quick succession. Recalculating. The arrow didn't move. "Turn left." Mara squeezed his arm. "Evan," she whispered, "it's not mapping the land. It's mapping us." The thought slid into place with sickening ease. The GPS didn't care about terrain. It cared about compliance, about the shortest route between intention and surrender. The wall wasn't an obstacle. It was a threshold the device believed they could cross if they agreed to the premise. Evan stepped closer to the rock. The surface shimmered subtly, heatless but alive with a faint distortion, like air above asphalt on a hot day. He raised a trembling hand and pressed his palm against it, The stone felt warm, not sun-warmed. Occupied. His skin tingled, a low vibration traveling up his arm, matching the steady pulse that had begun to assert itself in his chest. He pulled back with a gasp. The corridor tightened again. Mara turned toward the void behind them, eyes darting as if searching for a gap that might reopen if she looked hard enough. "If we don't do it," she said, voice thin, "it closes. If we do," she swallowed. "If we do, it opens." The GPS chimed softly, pleased. "Proceed." Evan's thoughts scattered, colliding with fragments of logic and instinct. He remembered something he'd read once about caves that weren't caves, about people convinced they could fit through spaces their bodies clearly could not. The mind can be persuaded to misjudge scale when the alternative is refusal. He realized then that the device wasn't asking them to break physics. It was asking them to accept a different measurement. "Don't," he said to Mara, though he wasn't sure what he meant. "Don't touch it. Don't believe it. Don't let it decide how big you are." Mara surprised him by stepping forward, not toward the wall, but toward the phone. She reached out and snatched it from his hands, her fingers white-knuckled around the edges. The vibration intensified immediately, the screen flaring brighter, the arrow pulsing with urgency. She squeezed her eyes shut and hurled it toward the void. The phone vanished without a sound. For a heartbeat, maybe two, everything held. The corridor stopped tightening. The wall's shimmer dimmed. Evan felt the pressure in his chest ease, just enough to draw a full breath. Relief surged, sharp and dizzying. Then the voice came, not from the phone, not from anywhere he could point to. It arrived fully formed, calm and conversational, as if continuing a discussion they'd already agreed to have. "You'll need guidance," it said mildly. "This area lacks landmarks." The arrow reappeared. It hung in the air where the phone had been, a thin blue outline hovering at chest height, rotating slowly until it faced the wall again. Text followed, crisp and helpful. "Turn left into the wall." Mara screamed. The sound tore through the corridor, ragged and human, and for a moment the geometry wavered, the trees leaning back as if startled by the noise. Evan seized the moment, grabbing her hand and running, not straight, not back, but diagonally, breaking the implied line, refusing the offered efficiency. The world resisted. The ground tilted, subtly at first, then more insistently, trying to guide their momentum back into alignment. Evan stumbled, caught himself, kept moving. He forced his breathing into chaos, short, sharp gasps, followed by held exhales, anything to deny the rhythm that wanted to take over. The arrow flickered, its smooth rotation stuttering as it tried to compensate. "Wrong way," the voice said, irritation seeping through the calm. "You're increasing travel time." The corridor fought back, trees sliding closer, with a dry, fibrous sound, branches brushing their shoulders. Evan felt the pull intensify, the sense that the easiest thing, the correct thing, would be to stop resisting and accept the turn. He imagined the relief of agreement, the way the pressure might ease if he just aligned himself properly. He didn't. They burst through the thinning edge of the corridor and spilled onto uneven ground, the geometry unraveling around them in a rush of disorder. Color bled back into the world in sickly washes, green, brown, the honest gray of stone. The arrow blinked rapidly, struggling to reorient, its text stuttering, recalculating. Evan didn't stop running until his lungs burned, and the ground beneath his feet felt reliably indifferent again. When he finally dared to look back, the corridor was gone. The rock wall stood where it always should have, solid and inert, no shimmer, no warmth. The void had closed, replaced by an ordinary slope cluttered with brush. Mara collapsed against a tree, sobbing, her hands shaking violently. Evan slid down beside her, heart still hammering, ears ringing with the echo of the voice that had tried so hard to be reasonable. They waited a long time before moving again. When they did, they didn't trust anything that chimed, vibrated, or offered certainty. They followed the messiest path they could find, doubling back, breaking lines, refusing efficiency at every turn. It took hours to reach a trail that appeared on both paper and instinct, and when they did, the relief was so intense it felt like grief. Later, Much later, Evan would check his account and find a single, time-stamped notification saved to the cloud. Route completed. No map, no coordinates, just a gentle suggestion beneath it, as if for next time. Faster options available. They did not realize at first that the forest had begun to repeat itself. After the corridor collapsed and the world regained its familiar weight, Evan and Mara moved with exaggerated caution, choosing routes that felt deliberately inefficient, zigzags through brush, detours over uneven ground, anything that resisted straight lines. They spoke rarely. When they did, their voices sounded too loud, as if the forest were no longer absorbing sound but measuring it. Each footstep felt earned, each pause intentional. The trail they finally reached looked right. Dirt worn into a shallow groove, boot prints layered over time, a signpost scarred with old carvings. Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Mara leaned into him, shaking, and for a moment the world felt merciful again. They started walking. 10 minutes later, they passed the same signpost. The carvings were identical. A crude heart, a date scratched shallow, a ranger's faded stencil warning about fire restrictions. Evan stopped so abruptly, Mara nearly collided with him. He turned in a slow circle, scanning for differences, new scuffs, broken twigs, anything that would mark time's passage. There were none. This isn't. Mara began, then fell silent as the truth settled. The trail hadn't led them forward. It had returned them, gently and without resistance, to the same point. The shortcut hadn't failed. It had succeeded, just not in the direction they assumed. Evan laughed under his breath, a short, disbelieving sound. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, that's fine. Loops happen." He tried to sound reasonable, as if reason were still a currency the place accepted. "We'll break it." He stepped off the trail to the right. The forest shifted, not dramatically, not enough to draw the eye. The light thinned just a fraction, shadows aligning into subtle parallels that guided him back toward the path. The ground sloped almost imperceptibly, making the trail the easiest option by default. Evan pushed harder, climbing over roots, forcing direction through effort alone. The effort exhausted him faster than it should have. His muscles burned with a dull, disproportionate ache, each step demanding more energy than the last. The forest did not push back. It simply made resistance expensive. Mara noticed too, her breath coming ragged, sweat chilling quickly in the cooling air. "Evan," she said, voice tight, "I think it wants us to be efficient." The idea was absurd, and yet everything about the place supported it. Straight lines felt easier. Pauses stretched uncomfortably long. Detours drained them. The path was offering itself as a kindness, a solution to the problem of wasted effort. The loop wasn't a trap so much as a demonstration. They returned to the signpost again. This time, something had changed. The carvings looked deeper, more confident, as if the hand that made them had pressed harder the second time around. Evan crouched and traced the heart with his finger. The groove felt warm, not from sun or friction, but from a lingering impression of use. He pulled his hand back quickly. Mara stared at the sign, eyes unfocused. "It's counting," she whispered. "Not us. The passes." A faint sound drifted through the trees, barely audible. Not a voice, not quite a hum. A rhythmic suggestion that matched the pace of a comfortable walk. Evan felt his feet twitch in response, eager to fall into step. "No," he said aloud, forcing himself to stomp, to disrupt the cadence. The sound wavered, then strengthened, adjusting to his new rhythm with unsettling ease. The trail ahead straightened. Where it curved before, it now ran clean and direct, the forest obligingly parting to offer a clear line forward. The signpost at their backs faded into shadow, its details blurring as if the place were losing interest in redundancy. Mara grabbed Evan's arm. "If we take it," she said, "we'll be faster." The admission scared him more than any threat the forest had made. Faster meant less thinking. Less thinking meant agreement. He imagined hours collapsing into minutes, the relief of forward progress without resistance. He imagined arriving somewhere, anywhere, just to stop feeling this constant negotiation. The shortcut waited. Evan closed his eyes and pictured the blue arrow, hovering patiently, offering the same reassurance it always had. He pictured how easy it would be to accept help, to let the path decide what mattered. His chest tightened as the pressure returned, subtle and persuasive, a hand at the small of his back guiding rather than shoving. Mara surprised him again. She sat down, right in the middle of the trail, legs crossed, pack thumping against the dirt. The rhythm faltered, the sound stuttering as if it hadn't accounted for refusal in that shape. Evan blinked, startled, then joined her. The ground cool and solid beneath him. They stayed there, breathing unevenly, refusing to move. Minutes stretched. The forest waited, patient, recalculating. The straight line ahead dulled, its clarity softening as if deprived of attention. Evan felt the pressure ebb slightly, like a tide pulling back to reassess. The signpost reappeared behind them, not exactly where it had been before, but close enough to be recognized. Its carvings looked shallower now, less sure. The warmth in the grooves had faded. Mara laughed weakly. "It hates when we waste time." Evan nodded, heart still racing. "Then we're going to be very inefficient." They stood and turned deliberately away from the offered line, choosing a messy route through low brush and fallen branches. The forest resisted at first, the ground subtly sloping, the light thinning, but the resistance weakened the longer they persisted. Each awkward step seemed to unteach the place something it had learned about them. Night fell unevenly, patches of darkness settling in strange places, but the loop did not reassert itself. When they finally reached a junction that felt truly new, different stones, different scars in the bark, Evan nearly cried with relief. They followed that trail until dawn, exhausted, scraped, and shaking. When sunlight finally broke through the canopy, color returned fully, honest and unfiltered. The forest stopped negotiating. Hours later, at the trailhead, Evan checked his phone with hands that still trembled. No signal, but the battery was warm. Deep in the settings, under a tab he'd never noticed before, a single log entry sat quietly, time-stamped multiple times over the night. Time saved. 0. Beneath it, in smaller text, a note that felt less like a suggestion and more like an observation. Optimal routes require cooperation. Evan shut the phone off and slid it deep into his pack, where it could not see the sky. He did not turn it back on. Not when they reached the road. Not when they reached home. Not even weeks later, when the memories softened around the edges. But sometimes, when he walks alone and chooses the longer way on purpose, he feels it, the faint easing of pressure, the sense that somewhere, something has marked him as unprofitable. And for now, that is enough. But he learned to fear helpful language. It began as a whisper of relief, a softening in the forest's posture as if it had finally accepted their inefficiency as a valid choice. The loops loosened, the straight lines dulled. Evan and Mara moved through uneven ground with the clumsy confidence of people who had decided that discomfort was preferable to guidance. Dawn had burned the worst of the fog away, leaving behind a washed, honest light that revealed scrapes, bruises, and the small indignities of survival. They spoke little, conserving words the way you conserve warmth. That was when the suggestion arrived. The phone warmed in Evan's pack, a gentle heat against his spine that felt almost apologetic. He stopped walking before he realized why, hand drifting back as if pulled by a thread. "Don't," Mara said immediately, her voice sharp with recognition. He froze, fingers hovering, and waited for the urge to pass. It didn't. He took the phone out and held it like something fragile. The screen was dark. No signal bars. No map. Just a faint glow at the edges, as if the device were remembering how to be on. He didn't press anything. The phone woke anyway. A simple message filled the display, no arrow this time. No blue line, no chirime that asked to be trusted. Just text, centered and calm. Ahead. Steep descent. Jump to shorten the distance. Mara stared at it, then at the terrain ahead. The trail sloped toward a ravine, where the ground fell away abruptly into mist. Not a sheer cliff, nothing so honest, but a drop concealed by brush and shadow, the bottom hidden by a gauze of drifting fog. It looked survivable in the way many bad decisions do from the wrong angle. Evan felt the old pressure gather behind his eyes, the familiar urge to agree. The words shortened the distance slid through him like a promise. He imagined the relief of landing, the way gravity might solve the problem decisively. He imagined time collapsing again, effort redeemed by efficiency. "No," he said aloud, more firmly than he felt. He turned the phone face down in his palm. The screen vibrated. Estimated time saved. Significant. The ravine breathed. Not wind, not sound. A subtle displacement that made the fog lift and sink as if something beneath it were inhaling. The edges of the drop sharpened in Evan's perception, geometry asserting itself where the land had been content to be vague. He took an involuntary step back. Mara grabbed his sleeve and yanked him farther from the edge, boots skidding on loose gravel. "Listen to me," she said, voice low and urgent. "It doesn't care if we live. It cares if we arrive." Oh, the phone pulsed again, warmer now, the text refreshing with an added line beneath the first. "Risk. Acceptable." Evan laughed, a hollow bark that scraped his throat. "Acceptable to who?" he demanded. But the forest did not answer. The fog thickened, erasing the bottom of the ravine completely. Without a visible end, the drop became abstract, less a fall than a transition. He felt the ground subtly reorient, the slope encouraging, the easiest path now angling toward the edge. The forest was not pushing. It was pricing, making refusal more expensive with every second they lingered. Mara did something unexpected. She threw a rock. It arced out over the ravine, vanished into the fog, and returned nothing. No sound, no impact, no confirmation of depth. The absence landed harder than any echo could have. The phone responded instantly, the vibration turning insistent, almost excited. "Proceed." Mara turned the device face up and stared into the glow. "It's learned us," she said quietly. "It knows we won't jump unless it feels reasonable." Evan's chest tightened. He remembered the loops, the corridors, the way the place had adapted to every refusal by refining its offers. This was the cleanest proposal yet. One decisive act to resolve uncertainty. He understood then that the forest wasn't trying to kill them. Death was just a side effect it didn't need to account for. "Turn it off," he said. "I did," Mara replied. "It doesn't matter, but I had of no better." The phone chimed, not a sound exactly, but a suggestion of one, like a remembered melody. The text updated again, softer, almost kind. "Alternative available. Jump together." The ravine seemed to widen, the fog lifting just enough to suggest space for two. Evan's breath caught. The idea was monstrous in its intimacy, in the way it repackaged terror as companionship. He felt the pull toward Mara, not romantic, not protective, but gravitational. A solution that kept them aligned. Mara's eyes filled with tears. "It's trying to make us agree," she whispered. "If we do it together, it completes something." Evan made a choice that felt like tearing muscle. He stepped sideways, not back, not forward. He dragged Mara with him, away from the implied axis, toward a tangle of deadfall and thorn that promised nothing but pain and delay. The ground resisted, the slope tilting treacherously, but he forced his weight down, refusing the geometry that wanted him cleanly aligned. The phone shrieked, not audibly, internally. The vibration surged to a painful intensity, heat blooming against his palm until he dropped it. The device hit the ground and skidded toward the ravine, stopping just short of the edge, as if considering its own advice. "Jump to shorten the distance," it insisted, the text now jittering, imperfect. Evan stamped on it. The screen cracked, spiderwebbing outward, the glow stuttering. The vibration faltered, then steadied again, stubborn as a heartbeat that refuses to stop. He kicked it into the brush, where it continued to pulse, the text fragmenting into partial phrases that no longer quite made sense. They did not look back. They crawled through thorns and over dead wood, skin torn, packs snagging, progress reduced to inches. The forest punished the inefficiency with exhaustion, with cramps and scraped knuckles. But the pressure eased with every messy step. The ravine receded behind them, its geometry dissolving into ordinary slope and shadow. Hours later, when they collapsed beneath a stand of living pines, the air felt indifferent again, honest. The fog thinned. The ground stopped, trying to sell them solutions. Evan lay on his back and stared at the sky until it stopped spinning. "It's not done," he said finally. Mara nodded. No, but it's disappointed. No. They rested until their hands stopped shaking, then stood and chose the longest, ugliest route they could find over ridges, around gullies, doubling back when the path looked too helpful. When they finally reached a road, their relief was quiet and incomplete. That night, in a borrowed motel room, Evan dreamed of a screen glowing in the dark. The words were simple, polite. Distance remains. They didn't talk about the forest after that. Not in the car, not in the motel room, not even weeks later when the bruises faded and the cuts closed into thin, pale lines. Silence became an agreement. The kind you don't negotiate because breaking it feels dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with memory. Evan drove. Mara watched the road unspool ahead of them, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through mist that thinned the farther they got from the trees. It should have ended there. The motel sat at the edge of a nowhere town. 2 lanes, a diner that never quite closed, a blinking vacancy sign missing 1 letter. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. Safe smells. Human smells. Evan locked the door out of habit and slid the deadbolt home, listening to the final click-like punctuation at the end of a sentence he wanted desperately to believe was complete. They slept in shifts. When Evan slept, he dreamed of distance measured incorrectly, miles compressing into inches, time folding until effort felt optional. When Mara slept, she dreamed of standing still while the world decided where she was allowed to be. Neither dream involved the forest directly. That felt intentional, as if whatever had followed them preferred subtlety now. Morning came gray and uncommitted. Evan showered, letting the hot water pound his shoulders until his thoughts slowed enough to behave. When he stepped back into the room, Mara was sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in her hands. Not the phone, a different one. Hers. I didn't turn it on, she said immediately, before he could ask. I haven't touched it since. You know, the screen glowed anyway. No map, no arrow, just text, centered and calm in the same neutral font Evan had come to hate. Searching for destination. Evan felt his pulse quicken despite himself. He crossed the room slowly, careful not to introduce a rhythm. Turn it off, he said, though he already knew how that usually went. I tried. Mara tilted the phone so he could see the cracked edge where she'd dropped it weeks ago. The battery percentage frozen at an impossible number. It doesn't need me anymore. The text refreshed. Destination found. The room seemed to tighten, not physically, but conceptually, like a place narrowing its definition of where you were allowed to stand. Evan glanced at the window. Outside, the parking lot stretched empty and uninteresting. Asphalt damp from early fog. Ordinary. He clung to that ordinariness like a lifeline. The phone vibrated once. You've arrived. They waited for the rest. For coordinates. For a map. For instructions that involved movement. Compliance. A final mistake. None came. The message sat there, complete and self-satisfied, as if arrival were a state rather than a location. This is stupid, Evan said, and the words sounded thin even to him. We're here, in a motel, off a highway. That's not... Look, Mara whispered. Evan followed her gaze to the bathroom mirror. At first, he saw only himself. A tired eyes, stubble, a thin cut along his jaw he didn't remember earning. Then the reflection shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that the depth felt wrong. The space behind them in the mirror looked longer than the room could accommodate, stretching back into a pale, indistinct corridor. A shortcut. Evan stepped closer to the mirror and felt the familiar pressure bloom behind his eyes. The urge wasn't to touch it. Not yet. The urge was to align, to stand just right, breathe just right, so the reflection in the room might agree on where he was. He forced himself to step sideways instead, breaking the line. The reflection lagged. For a fraction of a second, it did not follow. Mara gasped softly. It's not the forest, she said, understanding landing with quiet horror. It never was. It's whatever tells places how far apart they are. The phone chimed again, almost pleased. Distance optimized. The motel room felt smaller now, not by measurement, but by intention. The door seemed farther away than it should have been, the window less convincing. Evan felt the pull toward stillness, toward letting the room decide his position for him. Arrival, he realized, didn't mean you'd reach somewhere new. It meant something had finished reaching you. He grabbed his jacket and keys, heart hammering. "We're leaving," he said. The word rough but real. "Right now. Movement matters. Remember." Mara hesitated, eyes flicking to the phone, to the mirror, to the corners of the room that seemed to be learning their shapes too quickly. Then she nodded and stood, shoving the phone into the motel trash can without ceremony. The screen lit through the thin liner, recalculating. Evan didn't give it time. He grabbed the trash can and dumped it into the hallway, scattering wrappers and yesterday's newspapers across the carpet. The phone skidded and spun, its glow stuttering as it lost context. The pressure in the room wavered, lines blurring. They ran, not efficiently, not straight, down the stairs, out the side exit, across wet grass that soaked their shoes and ruined any clean cadence. Evan fumbled the keys and dropped them once, twice, laughing breathlessly as he finally got the door open. The engine coughed, then caught. They pulled onto the road without looking back. Miles passed. The pressure thinned. The mirror in the rear view reflected only road and sky and their own exhausted faces. When Evan finally dared to slow, the relief felt provisional, but real. He drove until the sun climbed high enough to burn the fog away completely. They stopped at a rest area and sat on a concrete bench, letting the world assert its honest distances again. Evan pulled out his phone, not the broken one, not Mara's, and turned it on. No signal. He smiled, shaky but sincere, and turned it back off. Weeks later, life resumed its uneven patterns. Work, groceries, long ways around when shortcuts presented themselves too neatly. They avoided helpful suggestions from machines, from people, from instincts that promised ease without cost. Evan learned to enjoy inefficiency. Mara took comfort in missed turns. Sometimes, though usually late at night, Evan would wake with the sense that something had finished measuring him. Not threatening, just complete. In those moments, he would get up and walk through the apartment, touching walls, opening windows, changing the shape of the space until the feeling loosened its grip. Once, months later, his cloud account sent a notification. No map, no route, just a single line of text, time-stamped while he slept. Arrival confirmed. Evan deleted the notification and turned the phone off. If you ever feel the urge to take a shortcut that doesn't exist on paper, if a device offers you a faster way through a place that feels too eager to help, remember this: getting lost is sometimes the only proof you haven't arrived somewhere you were never meant to be.